Today is Tuesday, October 12th, 2021, and the time is 9:03. The AB 3121 Task Force meeting is now called to order. Good morning, my name is Camila Moore, and I am the chair of the task force. Before we begin, let us have the staff to do a roll call for attendance and establish whether we have a quorum. Ms. Johnson, please cue Ms. Belton, who will call the roll call vote.
Yes. Deputy Attorney General Belton, please call the roll and advise the chairman whether a quorum is present.
Thank you, Chair Moore and Parliamentarian Johnson. We will now go in order and ask that the members indicate they're present. Chair Moore?
Present.
Vice Chair Dr. Brown?
Here.
Senator Stephen Bradford?
Here.
Dr. Cheryl Grills?
Present.
Lisa Holder?
Here.
Assemblymember Reginald Jones-Sawyer? Dr. Javon Scott-Lewis?
Present.
Don Tamaki? Councilmember Monica Montgomery Stepp? There are 9 members of the task force, and the number needed for quorum is 5. Madam Chair, there are 7 members of the task force present. A quorum has been established.
Thank you, Ms. Belton. Members of the task force and members of the public, welcome to the 4th meeting of the Historic California Reparations Task Force. As a reminder, the scope and powers of the task force are predicated on AB 3121, a legislative bill authored by California Secretary of State Shirley Weber and signed into passage by California Governor Gavin Newsom in September 2020. The law requires the 9-member task force to examine slavery that existed in the United States, discrimination in public and private sectors against those who were enslaved and their descendants, and the lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery. The law requires the task force recommend how California will issue a formal apology, how to eliminate discrimination in existing state laws, and how to establish new programs, policies, or projects to address the group's findings. The task force will also determine how any potential compensation should be calculated and who would be eligible, as well as additional forms of rehabilitation or restitution. In September, the task force held its first substantive hearing where we discussed the transatlantic slave trade, the institution of slavery, and the impetus and implications of the Great Migrations. And we had people testify like Isabel Wilkerson, John A. Powell, and Douglas Blackman. Today and tomorrow, the task force will begin to discuss contemporary harms against Black Americans in housing and education segregation, environmental racism, racism in banking, tax, and labor, and the racial wealth gap. From a review of the agenda, you can see that it is a full agenda. So to ensure that we complete it during the time allocated, we will need to make sure that we follow the timeline established. At this time, it is 9:06, and we will move to agenda item number 2, which is public comment, and we will end at 10:06. Now I would like to cue Ms. Walton. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Aisha Martin Walton, and I am with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Enforcement section, and we are now moving to public comment. Public comment will be for 1 hour. Each individual is limited to 3 minutes for public comment. At the 3-minute mark, your microphone will be turned off and you will not be able to turn yourself back on. However, there is a public comment period again tomorrow at the same time, and there will be more public meetings in the future, and we welcome everyone to participate. You may also submit written comments at any time via email at reparationstaskforce@doj.ca.gov. To participate in public comment this morning, please use the raise hand function. You can find that button on the upper right side of the screen on the sidebar that is the shape of a hand. Once you click on that, it will prompt a raise hand feature. On our end, we will accept your raised hand. Then you will get a notification at the top center of your screen to continue. You will have to click the comment period or the 3-minute mark. You will be muted and dropped back down to attendee. We will accept the raise hand functions as they come in. Once a person is in front of you is done speaking, we will say your name to prompt you, and you will begin speaking. That's the next person. Please note that there's a 20-second delay between the attendee and presenter mode. So please keep in mind as you are being prompted to presenter mode to provide public comment. So with that, Tunji, do we have a speaker in the queue? We'll hear from our first presentation.
Yes, Aisha. Hello, Angela. You have been unmuted, and now you may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Angela, we're not able to hear you. That's okay. That's all right. There you are. Thank you. Thank you, Angela. Tunji, next speaker, please.
Hello, Chris. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning. I put my jacket on for this. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for obviously your service, and that goes for the task force members and the staff and the parliamentarian and everyone who's making this happen, and you too, Aisha. Appreciate you as well. So. Members and the staff and the parliamentarian and everyone who's making this happen, and you too, Aisha. Appreciate you as well. So I did want to thank Dr. Javon Scott Lewis for joining our community meeting / town hall / listening session in Oakland on, I believe it was late last month, and we had a great conversation. So I did want to thank Dr. Lewis for joining us virtually. Really appreciated his time, and I also want to extend an invitation to Dr. Lewis and presumably also Mr. Don Tamaki to attend our next California Reparations community meeting hosted by CJEC, Coalition for Just and Equitable California, and ARCC, American Redress Coalition of California. This will be on Saturday, November 6th, from 2 to 4 p.m. at the 81st Avenue Library in East Oakland. Same place we did it last time. So the invitation is there to you both. I know you can only do 2 at a time, I guess, together in one place on the planet. So please join us there. We'd be more than happy to have you. And then also I want to give a shout out to Kim and Umoya from our ETM Media Squad, who are live streaming this right now on YouTube. Big shout out to the YouTube chat and the YouTube stream. I'm moderating. Thank you, and have a great meeting.
Thank you, Chris. Tunji, next speaker, please.
Hello, Ajiro. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Hello?
Hello, now we can hear you. There you go.
Okay, wonderful. My name is Adriel Okoro. I am the Policy Director for the Sacramento Housing Alliance, and we advocate for safe, affordable housing throughout the Sacramento region and throughout the state. Today, I would like to share the following recommendations. The following land access to safe and healthy communities and generational injustices require specific remedial measures. This task force is charged with analyzing the federal and state laws that discriminated against formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants, including redlining and predatory financial practices. There is a need to not only analyze and discuss specific strategies tied to the loss of individual and generational wealth in the form of land and housing, but a need to propose specific policy recommendations that will begin to provide a remedy to address systemic injustice evidence in the disparities we see in access to safe, affordable housing, homeownership, and generational wealth. Some of these specific injustices include segregation in housing due to exclusionary housing practice, including government-sanctioned prohibition in government programs to provide funds to acquire land and home ownership opportunities, redlining and restrictive covenants, conditions and restrictions preventing passing of land title to people of African descent, just compensation or return of land wrongfully taken by eminent domain without just compensation. The following are proposed measures to address access to homeownership, safe and healthy affordable housing in communities. First, with homeownership, there should be coordination with state programs such as Cal HFA and Cal Home to help provide first-time homebuyer assistance to descendants of enslaved Africans. This will include 0% interest loans, down payment assistance, credit counseling and financial literacy, and home preservation resources and financial support. We in turn also need to expand resources to community-based organizations that support homeownership opportunities, including Habitat for Humanity and NeighborWorks. In addition, we need to make sure there is increased affordable housing opportunities, increased investment in local projects to improve and increase access to de-restricted affordable housing in areas of opportunity, and transforming areas of high segregation and poverty into areas of opportunity in alignment with state and federal law to affirmatively further fair housing. There also needs to be increased investment in pipeline programs to provide residents in public housing or Section 8 with affordable housing and home ownership opportunities, including pipeline programs. We also need to have housing and justice reconciliation, research and compiling names and descendants of Black families whose land were taken by eminent domain for less than fair market value, and returning the land for fair market value plus costs, including the cost of inflation and relocation. In addition, there needs to be evaluation metrics and advertising to make sure that we reach all those.
Mr. Okoro, Mr. Okoro, I am so sorry to have to cut you off in the middle of your sentence, but your 3 minutes have expired. And again, we invite you to provide comments to the email
Okay.
address at reparationstaskforce@doj.ca.gov or come back tomorrow. Thank you. All right, Tunji, our next speaker, please.
Aisha, we are waiting on a participant now.
Okay.
So hello, Danielle. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Good morning. My name is Danielle E. Churcher. I am the descendant of Hubert Eves, a original Compton resident back in the early 30s and 40s, who relocated to Minnesota after various tyrannies that happened in California. I am only petitioning for one specific thing, that any redress injustices go specifically and solely to the American descendants of slavery. After 200 years, a civil war, and multiple bloodshed on this land, I believe that even if and with all melanated people, whether from Africa, Europe, Caribbean, South America, or even right here in the Americas, 250 years, slavery and a civil war would make us American. And the only tie that we have to any redress or justice would be the slavery that built America, as well as the broken promises of Special Field Order 15 that were solely and specifically to those Americans who were enslaved, solely and specifically for the redress of redlining, Jim Crow, and all the things that happened specifically to enslaved American descendants. Africans were all over the world, and African Americans exist even now today because they can come from Africa and be an African American today. But what no one can be is an American descendant of chattel slavery, ADOS, unless you've had ties directly to slavery. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Tunji, next speaker.
We currently have no speakers in the queue.
Madam Chair, how do you wish to proceed?
We can continue with the agenda, which is the approval of the minutes, and return to public comment in the event that there is additional public comment. And we'll recognize public comment until the notice time of 10:06.
Sounds good. Very good.
Thank you. Okay, so now the next item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes. The minutes from the September 23 and 24 task force meeting were sent to you with the materials, and you have had a chance to review them. Are there any questions, comments, or corrections regarding the minute? Hearing that there are no questions, comments, or corrections regarding the minutes, is there a motion to accept the minutes as presented?
Madam Chair,
Vice Chair Brown, you're recognized.
I move that we accept the minutes as presented.
Thank you, Vice Chair Brown. Is there a second to the motion?
Second.
It has been properly moved and seconded to adopt the minutes as presented. Is there any discussion? Hearing no discussion, we will vote. The vote will be by roll call, and when Ms. Belton calls the roll, task force members will answer stating either yay or yes if you are in favor of the motion, nay or no if you are opposed to the motion or against the motion, or I abstain if you do not wish to vote on the motion. Ms. Johnson, will you please cue Ms. Belton so that a roll call vote may be established? Thank you.
Yes. Ms. Belton, would you please call the roll and ask for the vote?
Thank you, Chair Moore and Parliamentarian Johnson. We will now go in order. Chair Moore, your vote, please.
Yay.
Chair Moore votes yay. Vice Chair Dr. Brown.
Aye.
Vice Chair Dr. Brown votes aye. Senator Stephen Bradford.
I'm abstaining because I have yet to see the minutes.
Senator Stephen Bradford abstains. Dr. Cheryl Groves.
Aye.
Dr. Cheryl Groves votes aye. Lisa Holder.
Aye.
Lisa Holder votes aye. Assemblymember Reginald Jones Sawyer. Dr. Javon Scott Lewis.
Aye.
Dr. Javon Scott Lewis votes aye. Don Tamaki. I'm sorry, sir, I didn't hear you.
Needs to unmute.
Aye.
Don Tamaki votes aye. Thank you. Councilmember Monica Montgomery Speck. Chair Moore, there are 7 members present and 6 members voting aye and 1 member abstaining on this motion.
Thank you, Ms. Belton. The vote was 6 ayes and 0 nays and 1 abstention. The ayes have it and the motion carries. The minutes are approved as presented. At this moment, we will return to public comment in the event that there are members of the public in the queue. Are there any members of the public in the queue at this time?
Oh, no one in the queue right now.
Okay. Well, members of the public, this is a reminder that the notice public comment period lasts between 9:06 and 10:06 a.m.
Excuse me, Chair Moore, we now have 2 people.
Okay, great. Thank you. We will return to public comment.
Tunji, can you bring the next speaker forward?
Hello, Kevin. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Hi. First of all, I wanted to thank this commission with all my heart. I believe that what you're doing is historic in the arc of human history. I have spoken with William Sandy Darity and with Kirsten Mullen. I believe they presented to this commission in some capacity in the past. I just wanted to amplify and weigh in that certainly when William and Kirsten when they've done 10 years of research about systemic racism and with their conclusions on the focus on reparations, I just want to provide my support for the idea of reparations, and I've certainly been pleased to see individual cities already taking some actions. And of course, I would have liked to have seen something done at the federal level, but I'm really just saying that if the panel hasn't read From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, I'm simply recommending that some or all consider. I'm sure you have too many things to do already, but I wanted to say that that seemed like 10 years of research seems like something that could be a good resource for you. So, and then lastly, if there's something that I could do at my company or I work at Salesforce and Tableau, we have a racial equity hub where we share data to try to solve for systemic racism. If there's something that I could do to share some of the data that you have available, would be excited to do that. Tableau has a very large platform, and we would love to amplify any excellent data that you have, any references and resources that Salesforce, Tableau, MuleSoft could bring to bear. We would love to help this cause. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kevin. All right, Tunji, I believe we have one more speaker.
Yes. Hello, Frank. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Frank, are you there? Tunji, Frank is not visible, nor can we hear him.
Okay, we can come back to Frank.
Okay. Is there anyone else in the queue at this time?
Yes, hello, Fernando. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Good morning. Am I being heard?
Yes.
Good morning, and thank you so much for this opportunity. It is such an honor to address this panel and the important work that you're doing. We had submitted comments at the last meeting, and I just wanted to reiterate Earth Justice's support of the work that you're doing here. My name is Fernando Gaitan. I'm a senior attorney with Earth Justice, an environmental law firm located here in California and throughout the country. This task force has already begun the important undertaking of gathering evidentiary documentation of the institution of slavery and that exists in the U.S. and its colonies. As Earth Justice attorneys, every day we have the privilege of representing and working in partnership with leaders fighting for racial and environmental justice in our communities. We applaud this committee for the holistic approach that is taking to addressing the legacy of racism and slavery in California and beyond, and in doing so, looking into its impact on environmental racism. Environmental racism is one feature of the systemic racism that drives shockingly disparate rates of death and disease for Black people, and relegates communities to highly polluted, environmentally degraded areas of our state. And it is not by accident that these same areas are now at the crosshairs of environmental degradation caused by rampant pollution, caused by extractive and exploitative economy that puts profit over people. Today, we are learning about the terrible and horrific oil spills spoiling our beaches and along our coast. But this is just one symptom of a long legacy of pollution. With the growing number of ships waiting in the ports, for example, to deliver goods, powered by that same crude that is now washing up on our beaches, they continue to pollute the air of port-adjacent communities in Long Beach and elsewhere, often clouding the air in Black neighborhoods. We know that in addition to that fight, Black communities are also resisting other compounding injustices that stem from chattel slavery and its legacy, racist policy, racist policing, and court.
Fernando, I'm so sorry to have to cut you off in the middle of your statement, but your 3 minutes have expired. Thank you so much. Tunji, are there any more speakers?
Yes, Aisha. Hello, Frank. We'll try again. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Frank? Are you there? We have 30 more minutes for public comment. Perhaps Frank can stay on and we can try again, Tunji.
Okay.
Is there anyone else?
Yes. Hello, Julia. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Wonderful job that you are doing on the task force, and we will continue to report on just that. And that was one of the things I did want to bring to your attention is oftentimes Black media is left out of this discussion when it's the most important aspect when we're talking about communicating to the masses. And the reason we dwindle down is just because of the acts of racism, discrimination that we deal with day in and day out. All of our publications, offline and offline, referring to digital, of such unreasonable expectations compared to the mainstream media that it blocks us out. And most of us are always operating on a shoestring budget, or often they override us by going to non-Black but Black targeted audience, but not necessarily Black owned. And yet we have been the voice for over a couple of centuries if we were to look at some of our Black newspapers who are struggling today. And it doesn't quite make sense for it to be such a struggle, but if we look at who is in charge of even our broadcast channels, how difficult it is, unless you are a millionaire like Byron Allen, it's very difficult even for we as a network when we were trying to get access just for a broadcast channel. And the number of licensings that they put out is just a couple. And it's only the select few that are able to get access to that. Digital marketing, same thing with Black media, same thing with our Black newspapers who are disenfranchised and often have to take the crumbs. And so we do hope that you consider Black media also in the forefront, who will continue to be your voice, who will continue to put the word out there. And again, I want to thank you for the wonderful job that you all continue to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Dunji, do we have anyone else that is ready to speak?
Yes. Hello, Faye. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Excuse me, Faye, we're having trouble hearing you. We're having trouble hearing your audio. Yeah, I'm sorry, we can't discern what you were saying. Perhaps you can check and come back. We do have about 25 more minutes. Thank you, Faye. Dunji, do we have a minute?
Yes, moving on, we will move to our next commenter. Hello, Kash. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
How y'all doing? Big hug to the panel and a deep bow to Mr. Tamaki. I wanted to say, I mentioned earlier in this same task force that to me, reparations, and for people in my generation I've been having conversations with, that it's a yes and not an either or. I just want to make sure that that's kept at the forefront of this conversation. We need to be able to check boxes for everything that we feel applies. As I mentioned earlier, 800 credit score reset, hashtag 40 acres in a Tesla, 160 acres, what have you. But again, to me, I only stick to land and cash payments. And specifically for today, I wanted to submit 2 things that I spoke about earlier in a bit more detail. First, with cash payments, I want to be very clear that from my understanding, American descendants of slavery, those who were not paid for the work done, are those who are specifically owed these cash payments. Direct cash payments, by the way, we're not really with trusts. We'd like it to go into our specific bank accounts. I wanted to mention Evanston, Illinois, and I wanted to mention Oregon. In Evanston, they are paying this reparation, albeit only $10 million, from the bigger piggy bank of just marijuana tax alone. And that's $582 million in the year 2020 that they generated, and it's projected to increase, by the way. I'm saying that we need to have a similar model for California at the very least, to save us time and excuses. Oregon set up lifetime payments, as I mentioned earlier, with Senate Bill 619, and tax exemption for these payments as well. As it's quoted here in Section 4 of Senate Bill 619, reparations paid under this section to this annuity are exempt from garnishment of all state, county, and municipal taxation, so on and so forth, not subject to bankruptcy or insolvency law. We need to have that same wording for California, and maybe even tweak it in case we need to correct it. I want to mention that if Oregon is able to generate $133 million in marijuana sales, and they're able to offer $123,000 a year for life, quick math for me in California with the $817 million that they generated in 2020 would say that they need to at least offer lifetime payments to every Californian of at least $100,000 a year for life. Let's make that a cool million, seeing as how pain and suffering. And again, I've heard from Dr. William Darity himself, Jr. himself, that states can afford to close the racial wealth gap in some of their respective cities, but it's not truly reparations or reparative justice for us until we're all free. So still support federal reparations. Thank you guys for the space and time.
Thank you, Cash. Tunji, do we have anyone else?
Yes. Hello, Jonathan. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
I was trying to take my camera off, but I guess it's not connected, but yeah, I can't get my camera unconnected because I like to get eye contact, but that's okay.
Oh.
Anyways, so Jonathan Burgess, for those of you guys that remember me, I am the great grandson of Rufus Burgess, who came here as a American slave. So I consider myself a descendant of American slavery. And my great-great-grandfather was brought here in 1849, only to be sold after he was here in California. When the evidence presents itself of our land to be returned, just like the Bruce Beach family, and I'm talking about the majority of a park that was taken by eminent domain. It was taken by condemning the land. I don't know any family that has deeds and documents like my family has, and the atrocity and the trauma that we've been placed through from the state of California doing nothing is traumatizing. What I want to say to this task force is I would ask you to move the senators, I would ask you to move the governor to do the right thing. In my family's case, but in all the families that were up there once occupying those hills. And Dr. Javon Scott Lewis, Marilyn Demas did work, and there's research already sitting at Berkeley about the colored church that sat there in Coloma. And the fact that we're being silent about it bothers me tremendously. I'd ask this last thing. Once the land is returned to my family, it's important that every child knows the importance of what African Americans, descendants of chattel slavery, did in the United States of America, but specifically California. My family was part of the forming of this California, from agriculture to manufacturing, the things that the colored citizens talk about we should be doing. And when you look at government contracts today, we don't rank in manufacturing, we don't rank in the sourcing and agriculture that the state of California is buying, and we don't rank in STEM. Those are three things. When I say STEM, I'll say this. I would ask that this council look at the African American Gold Rush Association.org, which is my nonprofit, to educate the fourth graders that have been misled for the last over 60 years since that park has been developed. There's been a misnomer about the contributions of the African Americans that were up in those hills, and there were thousands of them if you read the Colored Citizens Convention minutes. And it was actually, there's still a church up there, and we own that church today. My name's Jonathan Burgess. I am an American descendant of chattel slavery, and I yield the mic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Burgess. Tunji, do we have any other speakers today?
Hello, Robert. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
All right, I would just like to start by saying good morning to the commission. I hope all is well. And I'm going to start with, I would really hope that Attorney Antonio Moore, lawyer out of LA and UCLA alumni, will be able to give a presentation as an expert. I think he's done a good job at aggregating the data to tell the narrative of contemporary ADOS people. I would also like to ask the commission to consider giving Dr. Joseph Von Scott Lewis a chance to present. After learning about his qualifications at last month's CJEC meeting, and to the point of one of the previous callers' point about environmental justice, I think Dr. Scott has a lot of relevant information to share. Lastly, I would like to ask the commission to take greater care in selecting its witnesses. At last month's meeting, there were some comments made that were troublesome, to say the least. A joke made about chicken, and talk about the Evanston reparations bill, which even Evanston citizens, they weren't really happy with it. And so I just hope that as we continue on and as we start making proposals, that we take care, I guess, and that I'll leave it at that. And then also, I hope that people have reconsidered reinstating the live chat. I think that as we move through the meeting, there are a lot of good ideas that are had, but they're had on the YouTube chat. And so if the members of the commission can see what people are saying, maybe they could jot down a few notes or take into consideration some of the statements, and that could be some ideas used either as we go forward with the commission, or maybe at a future meeting. Just if you see a statement in the chat that's very interesting and touches up on a point that you maybe have already considered or you weren't considering. And that's where I'll end my my discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Tunji, do we have anyone else?
Hello, Michelle. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Okay, everyone can hear me now. Thank you. Okay, good morning. My name is Michelle Burton. I am the Chief Strategy Officer for Community Health Councils in South Los Angeles. First, I wanted to thank Dr. Grill. Thank you so much for doing the keynote address for our 30 youth activists of color across the state of California who graduated in the last month. So appreciate your involvement. I'd like to provide a few comments this morning on gentrification and its relationship to ongoing systemic racism and the harmful impacts of neoliberal capitalism, because there continues to be an ongoing lack of empirical research in some of these on some of these topics. So in the last couple of years or few years, I've explored gentrification studies. The research is heavily focused within urban studies, hundreds of articles around crime, racism, displacement, revitalization. But these are observable activities of gentrification, and that's what's of most interest to researchers. They involve the analysis and testing of data sets that point to increases or decreases in Black and white home ownership in given communities or crime patterns based on police reports and arrests. Empirical evidence is lacking, a common limitation reported by numerous researchers. So I say this to implore this group to use the power that you've been invested with to even demand or look at, maybe launching some empirical research related, to the work that you're going to be doing over the course of the next year. Of the empirical research available, the emphasis remains on the feelings or experiences of displacement and racism, which are, important. There's a strong connection historically in the patterns of gentrification, colonialism, imperialism, and revanchism. And these are impressively omitted from many scholarly discussions that have reduced gentrification to an isolated event, relevant only to patterns of human movement or the economics of investment. There is an element of anthropology involved, and anthropologists have provided support and research and should be included in this conversation around the relevance of gentrification, social justice, and the production of space as it relates to the topics that you'll be discussing in the next couple of days. So again, I just want to thank you all and hope you get used to hearing my voice, because I'm a big fan and I follow the task force. I get super excited when I see the next meeting is coming, and just want to underscore some of the colleagues who spoke earlier about leveraging the opportunity to get the word out. I would love to see this on the global stage and have the world watching this process, because it is a truly historical moment. So again, thank you for your commitment and efforts, and I look forward to paying attention and listening to what you all are doing and looking for opportunities to support your work.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle. Tunji, do we have another speaker?
Yes. Hello, Amaru. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Hello, yes, this is Amaru. Thank you for allowing me to speak. I want to say thank you to the great task force of California is getting this job done. I hope you guys can hear me well. I'm on the road.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. My GPS is going off, but real quick, I just want to make a short and sweet point. I'm a board member of the NCEEJ.org. It's based in California, but I'm also a Southern guy. I want to plead with the board because they're about to make a very, very important decision, and that's identifying who the group that is owed the debt to. And I want to say to the board that it's very important for you to do so. As we look in these modern day times of political correctness, we as American descendants of slavery are being shut out. We're being locked and things like that. That's why your decision will be so important. And as a Southern boy, it'd be so important because we have to understand that the harm and the damage that was done simply to the American descendant of slavery. I know people like to use enslaved people of African descent, but please understand that my grandfathers fought in every war that this country has ever had. We are Americans, and we wear our Americans with pride, not with shame, because we have made this country what it is, and that's almost a true democracy. Once the debt is paid, then it can't be the democracy that it strives to be. So I plead with the board upon deciding what the identifier or what you guys are going to call the identifying group that the harm was done to, please use the American descendant of slavery or slaves, because that is truly who it happens to. It didn't happen to people of color. It wasn't a black and brown issue, and it wasn't a BIPOC issue. So again, like I said, I'm going to keep it short and sweet. Understand this: when you're speaking about us, we are the true Americans. Thank you.
Thank you, Amaru. Tunji, do we have any other speakers?
Yes. Hello, Davenport Lobby. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Davenport, are you there? Tunji, we cannot hear Davenport or see Davenport.
I believe they left, so we will move to the next speaker or commentator. Hello, Russia. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Hello, I'm Russia Chavez, the Vice President of Policy and Government Affairs with Community Health Councils. I work along with Dr. Burton, who just spoke a couple of testimonies ago. Community Health Councils is a nonprofit community-based research, policy, and capacity building organization located in South Los Angeles. As an organization that focuses on developing people power, we would like to thank you all for all of your work and offer our support to help implement the community engagement strategy that you've been discussing, which is proposed to be led by the UCLA Ralph Bunche Center. As you continue to flesh out that specific strategy, we request your continued transparency so that the community organizations like Community Health Councils can activate our resources to ensure that the hard-to-reach Black communities can weigh in on this statewide discussion. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you so much, Russia, for your comments. Tunji, do we have any other speakers waiting in the queue?
Yes. Next, hello, Ernest. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Can you guys hear?
Ernest, I think we just lost you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, there you are.
All right. Okay, great. Good morning to the task force members of California. My name is Ernest Russell, and I am a treasurer of the Freedmen Agenda League of Michigan, which is a reparations organization located in Michigan. I do want to commend the task force for the efforts that you guys are taking as it relates to reparations. And I also want to state that, I would like to encourage you guys to remain bold in the face of change. And I would say that as you guys have further discussions, relating to the topic of reparations, I would like to ask or request that you guys further discuss the conversation of delineation. I believe that from the standpoint of disaggregation and delineation, it's important that when we assess the disparities that impact Black Americans who descend from slavery, that we look at it through a specific lens, because there is a specific timeline that occurred in America that a specific group of people had to suffer, and that includes the horrors of slavery and Jim Crow and what followed that. And so as reparations is being discussed and formulated, it must be stated that delineation is key, and that suggesting specific solutions to specific problems is almost what's most important when it comes to any type of reparations program. It has to be specific to the harms, and it has to satisfy the needs of the people who were harmed. And so with that being said, I just would like to also state that in California right now, Black Americans have a population of about 7%. Despite this 7%, this Black population makes up 27% of the Black prisoner population, according to 2010 data from prisonpolicy.org. Not only that, that 7% also makes up 31% of California's Black homeless population, according to recent articles that were published by, actually not even an article, one article was published by the LA Times, and then the other one was published by, I'm sorry, I have my sources mixed up, Los Angeles Almanac, and then the other was HUD exchange data. And then outside of that, it also stated that Black Americans had a poverty rate of about 19% in your state, while white Americans had a poverty rate of about 8.3%. I believe there's a direct correlation to slavery. I believe that all of the things you guys have been discussing has been pertinent to pertinent to reparations. I just also believe that we have to look at this situation and look at this moment in history through an honest lens, and try to be as brave as we can when it comes to delivering the justice that is owed to the specific ethnic group. And with that,
I hate to. Oh, it sounds like you were wrapping up.
Yep, I conclude.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for your comments today. Tunji, do we have any other speakers in the queue?
Yes. Hello, Devonport Law Lobbying. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Hello, everybody. How are y'all doing? Mr. Davenport here.
Hello.
Good. Y'all nod your head. Make sure I can see y'all. Or somebody thumb me up.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
All right.
Oh, y'all here. So, American descendants of slavery. Let's get that on the record, right? American descendants of slavery. Now let's just kind of relax so I could talk and get this out. So, Grandma Nancy, I find out, is registered as a freeman. So I'm a freeman, right? So for a lot of you all, y'all trying freeman, African descent, American descendants of slavery. This is how it goes. Although I'm a freeman, right? I'm American descendants of slavery, right? So again, get that on record, American descendants of slavery. Second point, African American, what's going on here? Well, when you do that U.S. Census block, you could be born in Africa and you come here and you can check Black. You could be born in Africa, come here and check African American, right? So there's a real social concern about people who are born in Africa. They come here, and then when these sort of restitutions, victims compensation / reparations programs come into be, they benefit because that wealth gap, right? We love Dr. Sandy Derry's numbers. We love the numbers with stratification economics, but I'm working with these. I made requests for them to get them narrow. We need separate numbers for ADOS. Don't let me lose you because I'm going fast. Long story short, you'll pull up a 2015 Nielsen survey, 2015, and you're going to figure out people like me, ADOS, our medium household wealth is on average 30% less than first year African born people who come over. You get what I'm saying? So all we're doing now is we got the best minds that's going to make the categories right, because we're not with the human trafficking and discrimination. We got some honest people. Think fair. Let's get this done. And closing, ADOS. Y'all already know ADOS leads the way. I love y'all. Hope y'all have fun.
Thank you, Davenport.
Because I did. Peace. Peace is profitable.
Thank you. Chair Moore, just to check in, it's 9:57 and we have about, 6-7 more minutes. So let's see who else is in the queue for you. Tunji, how many people do we have?
Aisha, we currently have 2 in the queue.
Okay, we have time. Next speaker, please. Tunji, you can call the next speaker forward, please.
Hello, Jackie. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Jackie.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Okay, I have 3 minutes. Okay, I'm Jackie Winter, a real estate agent in California. Within the context of this statement, you'll hear me say ADOS, A-D-O-S. That's the acronym for American Descendants of Slavery, for whom I'm an ally. Paul Revere Williams, one of the most celebrated architects California has ever produced, wrote, "Today I sketched the preliminary plans for a large country house, which will be erected in one of the most beautiful residential districts in the world. Sometimes I have dreamt of living there. I could afford such a home. But this evening I returned to my own small, inexpensive home in a comparatively undesirable section of Los Angeles. Dreams cannot alter facts. I know. I must always live in that locality or in another one like it because I'm a Negro. This is an essay, I Am a Negro, published in American Magazine in July of 1937. The National Housing Act of 1934, in which the FHA commissioned the Homeowners Loan Corporation to survey neighborhoods, ranked them from A to D, and colored code each of them. The A-rated neighborhood was coded green, a D was coded red, which meant least desirable. This is redlining, a practice that paralleled the act of restrictive land covenants and used as a legal weapon, blocked ADOs from living in green-coded area or an FHA-backed loan in a red area. In 1902, a California federal court hearing allowed individuals to discriminate contractually, therefore laying the groundwork for racially restrictive land covenants. Their first racially restrictive land covenants, which blocked ADOs and other non-white people from developments or specific property. Clauses were added to deeds, which specified who could and could not live in certain white neighborhoods. Heavily solicited by realty boards, California cities such as LA and San Francisco denied insuring home loans for ADOs, therefore robbing them of generational wealth. The National Association of Realtors president, Charlie Oppler, used a formal apology for the association's past policies that contributed to segregation and racial inequality in America. I quote, "We can't go back to fix the mistakes of the past, but we can look at this problem squarely in the eye, and on behalf of our industry, we can say what realtors did was shameful and we are sorry. Your sorry comes with a price, President Oppler, the price of generational wealth in California and across the nation. The price of eminent domain, a Jim Crow weapon still used today. Fact is, ADO's properties are underappraised by 23% based solely on their skin color. Cumulatively, that's $156 billion in lost equity, which could have financed 4 million businesses and paid for 8 million college degrees for ADO scholars. We are demanding the subpoena of documents from the National Association of Realtors and the California Association of Realtors regarding the information they have hidden for decades on California's racially restrictive covenants, contracts that placed in hidden deeds of properties and developments which kept out of home ownership and decades of generational wealth decimated to the likes of which we're still affected today. We are also demanding that every state include fair housing addendum in their real estate contracts to prevent real estate discrimination against Black American descendants of.
Jackie, I'm so sorry to interrupt you in the middle of your sentence, but your 3 minutes has expired. We invite you to come back tomorrow at the same time or provide an email comment. I believe at this point, Tunji, we have several people in the queue, and it is 10:02. Tunji, can you share with us how many people?
Aisha, we currently have 4 in the queue.
We have 4 in the queue. Chair Moore, it's 10:02, and we would technically have time for 1 or 2 more people. What is your pleasure?
Well, one of our panelists has a hard stop, and so we're going to have to take 2 to get to the 10:06 mark. So
All right.
for those who aren't able to make public comment, please come back tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Moore. Tunji?
Hello, Dawn. You have been unmuted and can now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Hello, and thank you for allowing me to speak. Thank you to the task force and Chairman Moore. My name is Dawn Alston Page. I am a reparationist. I am also a descendant of U.S. freedmen and a descendant of U.S. chattel slavery. My call today is to just point to the history of America in its ability to adeptly enumerate the tragedies of Black Americans, yet continuously falling short of actually addressing those. Time and time again, we have seen Black pain parlayed into policies for other groups. So our call today is to ask the task force to please be specific. Delineation is a critical element of establishing our claim. We are a unique group that has suffered a specific harm, and we want to ensure that those descendants are compensated and restored. I want to also come out as a strong advocate and supporter of CJEC as an anchor to work along with the Bunch Foundation to ensure that this information is received in our communities. I would also like to pre-introduce a witness tomorrow, Mrs. Okella Trice, who is 77 years old and has lived in South Central LA since 1968. She will be calling in tomorrow, but I would also ask that the task force call her as a witness, as she has a wealth of knowledge. I want to reiterate what a caller the other day said, Mr. Cash Gaines, regarding 40 acres and a Tesla. That has a lot of connotations. It brings together the past and the future. We know that 160 acres is what we deserve. But I think that particular call gets the message across. Let's remember that 47% of California is uninhabited, and we can easily fill that requirement, that debt that's owed. And there is no need to get land without cash, so let's not forget cash payments and land must go hand in hand. And I want to just say that in closing, that strengthening Black American descendants of chattel slavery is strengthening America and strengthens California. That money will go into a boom in construction, job creation in ancillary industries, and definitely contribute directly to the economy. So an investment in us is an investment in
Dawn, your
America.
time is up. I'm so sorry that your time has expired, but thank you for your comments today. The next speaker will be our very last speaker for the day. Or Chair Moore, you were about to say something? Oh, we can't hear you. You are on mute.
One of our panelists for our first hearing won't be able to make it today, and I'll make a fuller announcement once we get to that portion. But that panelist would have had 20 minutes to speak. And so if there, if we can take the last 3-4 people and that'll be it, and then we'll go straight to the panel.
Oh, okay, so instead of taking one more person, you would like to take 3 or 4.
Yeah, no more than 5, right? The last 2-3 people.
Okay. Tunji, the next speaker, please.
Hello, Elizabeth. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Okay, I'm actually driving right now, so please forgive my inability to be seen at the moment. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect, perfect. My name is Elizabeth Henry. Here, of course, ADOS, of course, we know American Descendants of Slavery, the group. And I just wanted to speak very briefly concerning the importance of this disaggregation and making sure that any legislation that's written for us concerning reparations is specifically for ADOS. I was privy to seeing a wealth simulation just the other day, and it showed the horrible, not only the horrible disparity between white wealth and ADOS wealth, but also how many pieces of legislation have been written that specifically kept ADOS bottom caste, that specifically came against ADOS and ADOS wealth, our ability to build wealth over the years. And that was only 13 of dozens of different pieces of legislation. So it's very important that as we go forward, we disaggregate and write ADOS specifically, American Descendants of Slavery, on any legislation that comes forth concerning reparations. Of course, there's a need for cash payments, but there's also a need for land grants, also a need for business grants, also a need for more funding for HBCUs so that we can begin to support all of the things that belong to us and the things that we've built historically, that we can begin to get those things back. So that is super important. I just wanted to press that disaggregation piece and just point out that even when it comes to the poorest white families in our country, they still have at least 20 times more wealth than ADOS families have. Our wealth, even in our poorest, sits at 0. And really the number is negative. I spoke to the presenters after the fact. The number was negative when it came to our wealth. So that's something that needs to be fixed as quickly as possible. Any emergency funding we could get, even as we start to write that legislation, would be great to save lives, because at the end of the day, that's what this wealth gap is costing us. It's costing us our lives. So I thank each and every one of you. I thank each and every one of you for listening and for allowing me to speak on this very important issue.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Tunji will take the next 3 speakers.
Hello, Marcus. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Good morning, Reparations Task Force. Thank you for giving me the time to speak. My name is Marcus Champion. I'm a board member for the National Assembly of American Slavery Descendants, Los Angeles, as well as a board member for the Coalition for a Just and Equitable California, also known as CJAC. And my comments will be short. I just wanted to make a request of the task force that with the conversation of eligibility coming up in soon coming task force meetings, that one of the expert witnesses that you guys bring on to talk about the clause of eligibility would be Dr. Shirley Weber, who is the author of the bill. I think that there will be lots of discussion and debate on what the clause of African Americans with the special consideration of African Americans who were descendants of persons enslaved in the United States, what that actually means. But the author of the bill, Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber, could give the proper insight as to what that clause actually means. So again, thank you, task force members, for all the work you do. Appreciate you guys making sure this is done right. Everyone have a good day.
Have a good day. Thank you so much, Marcus. Next speaker, please, Tunji.
Hello, Central Valley Urban Institution. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Good evening, task force members. My name is Eric Payne. I'm the executive director of the Central Valley Urban Institute based in Fresno, California. We serve several counties across the Central Valley, spanning from Kern County all the way to San Joaquin County. We represent the voices of hundreds of thousands of families here in the Central Valley, and specifically Black families. And so we look forward to further engaging with your task force on this conversation to present a case for reparations. After 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, and 60 years of separate but equal, 35 years of racist housing policies, now is the time for us to reckon with our compounding moral debts as a community and as a state. We are a part of a coalition of 40 Black, African American led and serving organizations across the state of California. And we look forward to learning more about this work and sharing our thoughts and ideas relative to this issue for the many Black families that we represent on the ground across the state of California. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks for your comments today. Tunji, the next speaker, please.
Hello, Kim. You have been unmuted and may now speak. You have 3 minutes.
Hi, can you hear me, everyone?
Yes, we can hear you, Kim.
Great. I want to thank the task force for this important work that you're doing. My name is Kim Mims. I'm also with Coalition for Just and Equitable California, as well as Amend the Mass Media, ETM Media, and we are streaming these task force meetings as a public service, just so we can get this information out to as many people as possible. I'll make this brief. Like my partner, teammate Chris Lodgton likes to say, we are just regular people. And my grievance is with the housing crisis of 2008. I haven't heard one person talk about the federally funded modification program and how many Black homeowners were locked out of that program. I've actually been in communications with Chase Bank to this very day about their breach of contract on my 2011 trial modification that has, left me in hardship for the last 11 years. I know that the task force has subpoena power, and I would like to implore the task force to, subpoena these big banking systems that were involved in the 2008 housing crisis, bank bailout. They were giving billions of dollars to help homeowners. And, I think a lot of Black homeowners were shut out of that. Of course, when I called for the data to see what those numbers look like, Chase will not provide that information to me. So again, I implore the task force to subpoena these executive banking institutions so we can see what those numbers look like. I believe that those numbers will look similar to, the Homestead Act, the GI Bill, and all of those other federally funded housing programs that Black people were largely left out of. So again, I just implore you to heavily investigate the banking system and the 2008 housing crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Kim, with task force members, Kim was our last speaker today. For anyone else who would like to make public comments, we've reached the end of our allotted public comment time today. However, if you are not able to provide public comment, we will be taking public comments again tomorrow at the same time. And also, you are always invited to submit comments and testimony via email at reparationstaskforce@doj.ca.gov. Thank you so much, and I will now turn it back over to Chair Moore.
Thank you, Ms. Martin Walton, for your assistance with the public comment period. Thank you, members of the public, for providing public comment. Now we will move to agenda item number 4, which is our first panel of the day on housing and education segregation, which will run until noon. As an announcement, I know it's highly anticipated, but Bobby Seale, who was the founding chairman of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, he is unable to make it with us today. In full transparency, he has some concerns about rights to publicity issues, given his stature as a public figure, and copyright issues with his testimony. And so we hope to adequately address his concerns so that he can participate in future hearings. With that, I would now like to remind each witness who is participating today that their testimony is recorded, live streamed, and will be available to the public. I will now introduce our first panelist, Dr. Stephen Menendian. Stephen Menendian is the Assistant Director and Director of Research at the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. Mr. Menendian spearheaded the Roots of Structural Racism study, revealing the persistence of racial residential segregation and its consequences, which was published in 2021 and leads a similar project focused on the San Francisco Bay Area. Mr. Menidian will have 20 minutes to speak. Then our next speaker will be Kavika Smith. Kavika Smith grew up in Los Angeles, California. In 2019, Mr. Smith was named plaintiff in the lawsuit against the University of California for discriminatory use of the SAT and the ACT in college admissions. Mr. Smith is currently a student at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. Then we will hear from Jacob Jackson. Jacob Jackson grew up in Los Angeles and is the current Los Angeles County Youth Commissioner. And Kavika Smith and Mr. Jackson will each have 10 minutes to speak. And then we will hear from Rucker Johnson, or Dr. Rucker Johnson. Dr. Rucker Johnson is the Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy in the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. He specializes in the economics of education, is the author of the 2019 book, Children of the Dream, Why School Integration Works. So after we hear from each witness, task force members will then have a period of 30 minutes for comments and questions. Thank you again to all of our panelists for our first panel of the day on housing and education segregation. And at this time, I will now like to turn it to Dr. Menidian.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the chair and the task force. It's an honor to be here and also to follow so many insightful and important public comments, remarkable comments. I'm going to start my timer so that I do not go over time. I've confined my remarks to 20 minutes. The big test here is going to be whether the share screen function works. So let's see if it does, and I'll get right underway. If someone could just politely confirm that you can see my, great. So I was asked to speak on housing inequality, housing discrimination, and housing segregation. I'll largely confine my remarks to that. You'll have to forgive me, I was hit with a cold recently, so I may have to grab some tea or tissue during this presentation. I have 4 areas I'm going to cover. And I've organized these areas not in any sequential manner, but rather from factual based to theoretical. So the last section I think will be the most important. I'm going to also speak quickly to make sure I get through everything. The first section is on racial residential segregation, measurement and findings. The second section is on correlates and effects of racial residential segregation. I have a brief set of slides on the racial wealth gap, although I know you're going to have a section on that tomorrow, but its relationship to home ownership. I'm going to talk about the causes and phases of evolution of racial residential segregation. But just some key terms: segregation is the separation of people in any particular area. So occupational segregation could be on the basis of gender, when women are pushed into nursing and men into being physicians, or other forms of occupational segregation. There's public accommodation segregation or education segregation. I'm going to talk mostly, actually exclusively, about housing segregation. Racial segregation is the separation of people on the basis of race. Segregation can happen on any basis: caste, gender, sexual orientation, disability, ability. Racial residential segregation is the spatial separation of people in terms of residence on the basis of race. There have been, for decades, ongoing and unresolved debates about precisely how to measure these phenomena. Let me just show you three measures and some updated facts based on the 2020 census. So the first and most popular measure of segregation is called the dissimilarity index, and if I have time, I can explain what this means later. But as of the 2020 census, which came out on August 12th of this year, and then the formatted data came out last month, the black-white dissimilarity score is 55. What this indicates is that 55% of either African Americans in the United States or white Americans, or some combination thereof, would have to move to a different race neighborhood to fully integrate. In other words, this means that we live in a very segregated society. This chart shows the evolution of the dissimilarity index from 1910 to 2020. We just had this created this weekend and has never been published before. But what I want to draw attention to here, and I think is relevant to the task force, is you'll notice that 1910, the black-white dissimilarity score is far lower than it is in 2020. And so when you think of segregation, so often we think of segregation as Jim Crow, which it largely is, or as sort of a post-bellum, post-Reconstruction phenomenon. It's not the case at all. You'll notice that black-white dissimilarity scores here peak in 1970, just when the Fair Housing Act goes into effect. And the overall peak is between 1950 and 1980, meaning the post-war period. This is a byproduct of something I'll talk in the fourth section in my talk, of the post-war period and government activity. This is a chart of dissimilarity scores in the Bay Area. Interestingly and disturbingly, black-white dissimilarity in the 9-county Bay Area is actually higher than it is nationally. You can see it's a 0.574 score. Although it's much like the United States declined, the thing I want to point out here is that white Asian and white Latino dissimilarity has risen since 1970, and in fact does not fall. So white Asian dissimilarity in the Bay Area is essentially where it was in 2010, which is higher than it was in any preceding decade. The second measure of segregation is called the isolation or exposure index. These are a combination of indices, but they measure the flip side of the same thing. It essentially measures what the typical neighborhood of or actually average neighborhood of a member of a racial group looks like. So what does this tell us based on the 2020 census data? Nationally, the average white resident of a metropolitan area lives in a neighborhood that's 69% white, 9% black, 12% Hispanic, and 6% Asian. Contrast this with the average African American who lives in a neighborhood that's 41% black, 34% white, 17% Hispanic, and 6% Asian. In other words, these are demographically different worlds. And so they are fiscally in terms of neighborhood conditions, amenities, and life outcomes, which I'll talk about in a moment. Here is the exposure index is essentially the data that shows different race interactions here based on neighborhoods. The isolation is the figure that shows the percentage same race. Here's the isolation index that shows, the exposure index for Black Americans, 1940 to 2020. This is essentially showing you the percentage of white people in the average Black person's neighborhood. Notice that the average number of white people is 34% in 2020, which is lower than it was in 1950 and significantly lower than it was in 1940. Meaning again that the average typical Black person's neighborhood is much less white in the post-war period than it was beforehand. I also have this data for the Bay Area, but I don't have time to get into it. I'm running really low on time. There's a relatively new measure called the divergence index. The divergence index measures a larger geography to a smaller geography and can measure multiple races at once. Using this measure, we found that 54% of metropolitan regions in the country that have more than 200,000 residents were more segregated as of 2020 than they were in 1990. And almost a quarter were more segregated in 2020 than 2010. In the Bay Area, I'm going to show you a chart in a moment, we found that the Bay Area was significantly more segregated in 2020 than it was in 1970. 7 of the 9 counties in the Bay Area have higher divergence scores in 2020 than in either 1980 or 1990. Only 2 counties have lower scores, Alameda and San Francisco. You can see the scores here. Here's the Bay Area divergence scores over the past 6 decades. This blue line right here is Marin, which is by far the most segregated county in the Bay Area. Okay, so what are some of the correlates and effects? There's just a mountain of research studying either the direct effects, racial residential segregation, or the correlates, primarily in the arenas of health, public health, economics, and education and environment. Rucker's going to talk about education, so I'm going to leave that to him. There is just an enormous body of literature on the specific effects of racial residential segregation relating to infant and maternal mortality, asthma, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension, obesity, lead exposure, and many other health conditions, including COVID-19 infections. There's also research on access to amenities in segregated neighborhoods, particularly segregated communities of color, such as grocery stores, childcare facilities, parks and recreational spaces, safety of those environments, clinics and primary care providers, and even hazardous waste facilities. In a study a few years ago by the chair of sociology, Robert Sampson at Harvard, he claims that lead toxicity may be the major environmental pathway through which racial segregation contributes to the legacy of Black disadvantage in the United States. And there's a number of interesting studies, disturbing studies on that. This is not an abstract problem. The study that was mentioned at the top that we launched, The Roots of Structural Racism, basically looked at life outcomes and correlates across a number of different measures. We found the neighborhood poverty rates were highest in segregated communities of color, 3 times as large as poverty rates in segregated white communities. We found that Black children raised using the Opportunity Atlas, Roz Chetty's Opportunity Atlas, Black children raised in integrated neighborhoods earn nearly $1,000 more per year as adults and $4,000 more per year when raised in white segregated neighborhoods than those raised in highly segregated communities of color. We looked at the relationship between redline neighborhoods using the Hulk maps and found that 83% of neighborhoods that were given poor ratings as D grades in the Hulk maps were highly segregated communities of color in 2010. So there's a long tail to government policy here. This is a chart, table 4 in our study, that shows specific life outcomes across these 3 types of neighborhoods: integrated neighborhoods, highly segregated communities of color, and highly segregated white communities. You can see, for example, that median household income is twice as large in highly segregated white neighborhoods as in highly segregated communities of color. Same thing for home values and so on. Even life expectancy has differences. But one of the things I just want to point out is that these are structural features, not individual, because when we look at individuals, we find that they have different outcomes based on race, depending on the environment and the structural conditions of those neighborhoods. So again, Black children growing up in white, highly segregated white neighborhoods, you can see earn, as I said, $4,000 more per year as adults than Black children growing up in highly segregated communities of color. And you can study this later, I just don't have time. Part 3, just an aside on homeownership. I have myself at 9 minutes left, by the way. So here are the most recent homeownership figures by race. As of 2019, white Americans, 73% of white Americans own their own home, 58% of Asians, 47.5% of Latinos, and only 42% of Black Americans. Just as an aside on this aside, the overall racial disparity actually masks even larger generational differences. Black Americans born before 1930 only lag white Americans in terms of homeownership by 5%, but Black Americans aged 35 to 44 have actually a 33.5% disparity. So here's a line chart that shows disparities in homeownership by race. I know you have a panel tomorrow on the racial wealth gap, but I wanted to just outline in relation to housing the consequences of this homeownership gap in terms of Black wealth. So one of the callers noted the effects of the subprime mortgage crisis, which I think is quite important to wealth. For white Americans, home equity is only 43% of net worth compared to 60% for Black Americans, which means that the homeownership gap has a much larger effect on Black wealth than it does on white wealth. So 3 specific figures I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you a chart I put together specifically for this presentation. In 2016, the average Black household net worth was $138,000, while the mean white household net worth was $933,000, $934,000, a relative disparity of 7 times. And by the way, this data is from the Federal Reserve's Consumer Finance Survey, and I have 2019 data I'm going to show you in a moment. But the median difference, not the mean difference, obviously the mean difference is affected by extremely wealthy white people, but if you just look at median, the disparity is even greater. The typical white family had wealth median of $171,000, whereas the typical Black family median had only wealth of $17,000 in 2016. When you exclude housing as part of that wealth, the disparity reaches its zenith of nearly 18.5, leaving Black wealth at just $930 per family. I put this together. I was yesterday specifically for this talk, so this has never been created before to the best of my knowledge. But one of the things I wanted to share about this is look at where Black wealth was after the subprime mortgage crisis, just at $2,200 median per family. Now, the good news is it's gone up, and the good news is the disparity ratio has gone down, but notice that the absolute disparity continues to increase. So a focus on the disparity ratio actually masks significant increases in the absolute disparity. Now I'm going to get to the heart of the talk. What explains racial residential segregation? Well, remarkably, there's no consensus in the academic literature on this. There's 3 common explanations. The first is discrimination in housing markets. This could be homeowner or landlord discrimination. This could also refer to real estate discrimination by realtors. There's a lot of of discrimination. A study, the HDS studies commissioned by HUD every 10 years uncover quite a bit of discrimination, as did an interesting undercover research project by Newsday, a newspaper on Long Island, with hidden cameras that uncovered significant discrimination in steering. The second theory is divergent compositional preferences, meaning that different race people have different preferences in terms of the types of neighborhoods they want to live in. The third theory is economic differences between racial groups. That is, differences in income and accumulated wealth produce differences in terms of the types of neighborhoods that those families can buy into. Now, what's interesting is that there are theories to support each of these. There's evidence to support each of these theories, but there's also evidence that undermines each of these theories. So, for example, although there may be differences in compositional preferences, survey data consistently finds that different race families prefer to live in more diverse neighborhoods than they currently do. Also, there is significant evidence using the HDS studies that I mentioned before, the housing discrimination surveys since 1980, that specific instances of housing discrimination have gone down. There are additional explanations. So Maria Kreisen and Kyle Crowder wrote a remarkable book in which they argued the differences in background knowledge of neighborhoods may play a significant role in the search process and also the pre-search process. And they have significant empirical evidence to support this. There's also the theory of white avoidance of Black and Latino neighborhoods. The new economic Nobel laureate, David Card, Edward Glaser, and Vigdor have propounded this theory as an explanatory factor. The truth is that there is no consensus on which of these theories is the predominant explanation. A lot of people assume it's discrimination, but I actually think structural factors probably lean to either 2, 3, or 4. And I think 5 is probably significant. In fact, I think all of these play a role. It's just there's no consensus in the literature. I have a little over 3.5 minutes left according to my timer. These are some heuristics that I've created when I talk about housing segregation to think about it. Very broadly, there are, I think, 3 phases in the evolution of racial residential segregation in the United States. The first phase is what I call the local real estate industry era. Remember, I showed you the dissimilarity index chart earlier that shows that actually dissimilarity scores from 1900 were relatively low across the United States, and they actually were lower in the South in many cases. The primary driver here in 1900 and 1930 was actually local government and the local real estate industry and neighborhood associations pushing for restrictive deeds. These were deed provisions that prohibited individual sellers from selling to people of particular race, and eventually restrictive covenants, which played a much larger role in new subdivisions and developments that prohibited on a large scale basis new developments, homes in those developments being sold to people of particular races or even religions, in many cases, including, for example, Jewish people or non-Christian people from buying homes. The second era is what I call the federal government era, extends and deepens. This is 1930 to 1970, and the primary mechanisms were segregated public housing and then, of course, redlining through the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the FHA. Now, there's a lot of debate here as to whether government caused or simply deepened or extended it. You can look up this literature between Richard Rothstein and Richard Walker, for example. I take the position the federal government came in and sort of extended and deepened what was happening at the local level, and as such spread it and deepened it across the United States. And then there's the third era, which is 1970, post-Fair Housing Act to the present. The primary mechanisms of sustaining and perpetuating racial residential segregation are sort of zoning and exclusionary land use power, municipal power, incorporation, fiscal policies, and the like. Down to a little minute and 45 seconds. Just to give you a little bit more information on this, there have been, in the last 10 years, some remarkable large-scale mapping projects, mapping racially restrictive covenants in about 10 cities. The 2 large ones that began were in Minneapolis and Seattle, and they've uncovered in both of those regions about 25 specific, proven, established instances of racially restrictive covenants across the region. Other regions' documentation projects are underway. It will be some time until we actually have great comprehensive data on racially restrictive covenants. We do have now digitized over 200 redlining maps. Those are available online, and they're actually also on the interactive mapping tool for our Roots of Structural Racism project. We have also done a number of zoning maps in the Bay Area and found, this is, by the way, our Roots of Structural Racism segregation map. There's strong correlation, as I mentioned, between segregation and these other features. Opportunity Atlas looks at this. This is the zoning map we created for the Bay Area. We found that when you account for every municipality, including those that are under 10,000 people, 85% of all residential land is zoned exclusively for single family zoning, which excludes multifamily developments. And here's the correlation between single family zoning and race. As you increase the percentage of single family zoning, you go heavily white in the Bay Area, and the percentage black goes to 1%, and Latino collapses. So there's a strong correlation between racial residential segregation and zoning. I have 2 slides left, which I don't really have time to get into, so maybe I can address them in the Q&A on de jure and de facto. Oops. So I just have 2 slides on that. If you'd like to ask about that, I'd love to get to that. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Menidian. Thank you for that expert testimony. We will now go to Mr. Smith, who will have 10 minutes to speak. And Mr. Smith, you may begin your personal testimony when you are ready. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kavika Smith, as was stated, and I'm a 19-year-old from South Central Los Angeles. I'm a junior at the illustrious Morehouse College, where I'm studying sociology, and I intend on returning back home to California to pursue my master's in public policy and my Juris Doctorate. I'm a young Black man who, not only the son of a home care union worker, but also the mentee of Supervisor Holly J. Mitchell. And I've been civically engaged since I was 8 years old, beginning with my mother's union, SEIU Local 2015, where I began my civic engagement fighting for home care workers' wages and workers' rights. And I've gone on since then to fight against hair discrimination alongside then Senator Mitchell with the Crown Act, in which I gave a TEDx talk about it. And more recently, I've led in the Smith versus UC Regents case, where we demanded that the UC Regents remove the standardized testing requirement from their admissions process, as we showed that historically the SAT, the ACT, and the standardized testing itself has served as a racist barrier that has prevented many Black and other marginalized groups from accessing higher education. And I'm here today to detail 2 things: my experience with the SAT and my recommendations for educational reparation. As many of you know, Verbum Day High School is a private Jesuit all-male high school located in Watt, where the majority of us are low income and all of us are of color, 70% being Latinx, 30% Black. Growing up, I was told that the SAT was going to determine whether I was going to go to college and which college I'd attend. And when I think back on the day that I ended up taking the SAT, I'm immediately met with this memory of feeling like I wasn't worthy or capable of being in a collegiate environment. And this singular test determined that I would not be eligible for scholarship opportunities despite my academic achievements and having been in need of financial support to afford college. And I can go on and on about the racist implications of this test, but we have heard it all before. Standardized testing is only a layer of the compounded ills that have for ages plagued America's educational system. And I was in my junior year when I decided to finally activate my faith and set out to systematically and systemically change the system, because I was, as in the words of my shero, Fannie Lou Hamer, sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I found myself, in this constant rage because people within my community felt disempowered, and those outside of my community didn't quite understand as to why I was doing what I was doing. And they thought that I was simply asking for a handout when I wasn't. But through it all, I knew that I was doing what was right and what was necessary. And what was right and necessary is that we made higher education accessible for all Black kids. And that I wanted to ensure that being the case by making the college admission process more accessible for Black people who have otherwise been ousted and have had to prove themselves time and time again. And we are currently witnessing the fruit of our labor in that less than a year after removing the testing requirements from the UC system, we have seen the most diverse class of students. And so as we're on this road towards reparation, or as we have this conversation about reparations, we must understand a few things. Reparation looks like, for me personally, reparation looks like universal pre-K for all Black students. We know that exposing exposing youth early on to books, exposing them to education earlier on, heightens their likelihood or puts them in a position to be better off later on in their life, better off in their educational journey. And so because education has been stripped from Black folks for so long, we must ensure that Black folks have access early on, as early as pre-K. We need to reinvest and begin to invest in freedom schools. And these schools have been looked down upon, but for me, I've experienced them. I have friends who have experienced freedom schools, and freedom schools is honestly a space and a place where we're able to be challenged in terms of social understanding, social knowledge, activism. We're able to engage one another in conversations about culture and engage in one another in terms of academics. And it's better. I've found it more of a safe haven, more of something that is culturally responsive, culturally understanding than my actual school. Another thing in terms of this conversation of reparations, I strongly believe that we need to revisit the property tax laws and the algorithms of how schools are funded. I have friends who went to a school in Los Angeles where they went without paper for 3 months, simply because the school was underfunded. But I also had colleagues who are schoolmates, folks that I worked with, that their school had extra funding and their school bought a fountain. And I can only imagine if that money was redirected into a Black school where they needed the money. What could that have meant for those Black students? And so I think we definitely need to revisit that and make sure that these property tax laws and school funding algorithms are more equitable, making sure that Black students are getting what they need. And another thing is funding Black students. And so that looks like not only getting us into the UCs, not only getting us into the collegiate environment, but making sure that we see ourselves through this, making sure that Black students have a whole wraparound team support system. Because I don't know how to explain it. You get us into the UC system and then drop us off there, and we no longer have access. We're not able to afford it. We're not able to have the access to psychiatrists or therapists. And so we need all of these resources, and ensuring these resources, that is a form of reparations for me, because for so long we have been denied the access to those things. And so we also need to recognize the cultural differences in schools. I have been privileged to attend schools where majority of my teachers were Black, but I have friends who they didn't have that privilege. And so their teachers didn't understand where they were coming from when they would come to school and have issues that pertain to a certain upbringing. The teacher wasn't able to meet that student where they were at. And so it began this disconnect and this disengagement within the classroom. And so I think as we talk about reparations, we really need to be intentional about who is educating our students, who are educating the Black students in the classrooms. And so we need to also make sure that our expert educators that have the wherewithal, that have the cultural understanding of what it means to be Black, of the Black experience, they are placed in schools where they're needed the most. And so I think that is the conversation that we need to have. We no longer can talk about or sit back and pontificate and talk about peeling back layers and actually not following through with that. For me, at this point, I believe that we must uproot this current system and do away with it. It has proven to be archaic. It has proven to be anti-Black. It has proven to be capitalist. It has shown its head through and through. And so now it's a matter of if and when we're ready, we must reimagine what it means to be free. We must reimagine what it means for reparation, or what it means to actually have reparations, to actualize that, and not to just sit there and pontificate. And with that, I thank you for allowing me this space and this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, for that incredibly moving personal testimony. We will now turn to Mr. Jackson. You have 10 minutes to speak, and you may begin your personal testimony when you are ready. Thank you, Commissioner Jackson.
Thank you. Can y'all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Appreciate y'all. Good morning. My name is Jacob Jackson. I'm with the Youth Justice Coalition, and my pronouns are he, him, his. Thank you so much to the DOJ Task Force and Camilla Moore for allowing me to speak today. All right. I felt like I've been tracked my entire life through elementary to high school. I was pushed out of Hyde Park Elementary School in the 3rd grade for being on the wrong side of the tracks when I lived 2 blocks away. I was also pushed out of my last high school and affected by the school to jail track due to a mild altercation with a teacher and interaction with school police. The school that I attended was Crenshaw High School. When I started going to Crenshaw High, my goals and mindset were aimed at going to school every day. My intentions was always to finish high school and pass all of my classes. I had to get at least a C or higher. I felt that it would be hard to get an A, but I would be successful and satisfied with a C or B. I started out in the beginning maintaining a good grade average and going to all my classes, meeting all my new teachers, and greeting them with all politeness and respect. I enjoy PE a lot, and I loved going to my 7th period, which was graphic design. I walked around the campus trying to learn all my new classes, classroom for the new semester. Then I suddenly realized I was right next to the school police office. When 2 of the school police officers walk outside the office, they started staring at me and talking amongst themselves. It felt as if they were talking about me, profiling me, adding a label on me, which I didn't think I fit. I could see that they were prejudging me. For that time, I was going to Crenshaw High. I would always be at school and in class, completing as much work as possible. My 7th period and my PE class were 2 of my favorite classes. I love attending them. My 7th period was graphic design, and anything I had to do with computers always sparked my interest in doing work. 2 weeks passed, and everything was going better. Then, unexpectedly, my 7th period teacher was switched out for a substitute teacher. While coming from my 6th period, which was history class, I was going to 7th period, and I would always be one of the first students in class. I always like to get ahead and finish my work early. The new substitute teacher had just started, and he didn't know everybody on the attendance sheet. He said this class wasn't the class I was supposed to be in. I told him continuously this was my class, and that he could even call the principal or the front desk to solve the matter. So I went to the desk to use computer and go online and create some design. Just then, he tried to pull me away from computer. I said, as he was doing that, I told him to stop touching me, and I barely grazed his skin, pushing him back just a step. He instantly threatened. He instantly started to threaten me. His first words were, "I can have you in jail right now. You could be arrested for hitting me." Rarely, he told me I used to be a WWE wrestler, and if we were in the ring, I would take you out. I told him that I barely grazed him and that he was over exaggerating what I did, but he wasn't. He wasn't justified in putting his hands on me first. I began to tell him it was all right that I had learned my lesson. I also apologized for what I did. So he let me stay in class to do my work, but it seemed like it wasn't enough for him, and that he wasn't satisfied. The next day, I was ecstatic to go to school to finish work, and I missed one of my English classes while I was waiting in the lunch lot. The school police approached me and they asked me, "Are you Jacob Jackson?" I told them, "Yes, I am." They said I had to come with them. They didn't tell me what was going on until they put me in a room and told me to wait. The teacher came next saying, uh, uh, my bad. Uh, the teacher came next saying I could press charges on you. You can see how being in juvenile will feel. He kept on saying that he used to be a pro wrestler, and if he was in the ring, he would easily take me down. The officers checked me first and put me in the cuffs uh, for the moment. Their favorite line was that if he pressed charges, you're going straight to jail. I told him that I didn't mean to touch him. I already apologized for my mistake. They told me I'd be doing merely years for just touching him. And after it was finished, they told me that they would always be watching me. They said, "You're just like everybody else at the school," in a negative way. This was the first time I have interactions with police at school. I felt scared and anxious and unclear of what to do or what was going to happen. After being pushed out of Crenshaw High School, I had caught 2 cases in the years leading after that. One was 459 burglary and 487 grand theft person. Looking back, if I had continued in in school, in hindsight, it is clearer than when you're in the moment. Um, I went to school for 2.5 years and never got the credit at Crenshaw High School. I made up the time and graduated last year from Free LA High in 2020, thanks to Youth Justice Coalition. And My hopes and dreams for myself is to go to college and be able to have the opportunity to explore life from there. Uh, the U.S. government after World War II bought white people houses to go to and to go to college for free, but not black people. My brother didn't get the chance to see 21, and I'm only 20 years old. I would love to see my friends and family have a chance to grow up and take charge in their dreams and community that's not overrun with cops, drugs, that's has no real mental health support. Bring back the arts and culture to the communities, parks and recreation centers, and robust holistic youth departments with community and youth engagement. Um, I just wanted to say that my mom has lived and grew up in LA since she was 2. Life wasn't easy for her. It was stressful for her to find work and hard to manage money to get a house as a single mother. My mom has lived in the Crenshaw district with my sister and late brother for over 40 years, since 1980, because anywhere else was hard to pay rent. She told me, and I quote, how are they going to pay higher rent? A lot of people are too proud to get on welfare. When you do get on welfare, they cut half your check until you don't need it anymore. In order to get housing, you got to be close to homeless or homeless. In 1992, she moved to where we currently live. My sister, her husband, was my brother's role model around this time. My brother-in-law went to prison, and my brother was left with less guidance. By 1994, my brother was shot and killed by LA County Sheriff deputy and bled out due to the officers on scene not calling ambulances. My mom had a lot of stress and was very hypervigilant with me and my brother's safety. My mom has struggled all her life to pay the rent after my brother died and has not received any support. And we would love to keep building our life. In 2001, I was adopted from an abusive family. I've always had a discomfort towards cops due to my brother being shot and killed in 1994 by LA County Sheriff deputies. They let him bleed out as no ambulances were called. My brother was 20 when he died. Police contact is also the reason why I was pushed out of high school. Um, and then I made these mistakes because I was out of school and the lack of resources in the community that I have left the community are out of reach for me. If schools were more accessible and more accountable for Black students, it would have been more easier for me to navigate. What I want to see for myself is someone held accountable for my brother, properly investigated and to sue them. My mother was grieving for the loss of her son, who didn't have the money and there was hidden information. I would like the process to be easier to hold people to their accountability. What I wish their school provided for me when I was there was real counselors, after school programs, real nurses, Black people history, uh, peace building, and TJ practice, and etc. More. And having these experiences make me question why the police at school, why are there police at school? Why the California government doesn't have resources to help low income communities like mine? Why is it when I walk communities I see liquor stores broke down, cars always construction repaired on messed up streets, no fresh food markets, the same junk food every day? How can you be 18 and smoke a cigarette, 17 and join the army, but California has no minimum age for sending children to juvie? We've been put in the ghetto, and when I visit other cities or even just Hollywood, it's different outlets, stores, malls, decent roads, and everything clean from head to toe. These are things that happened to me and my family. While my experience was bad, it is not unique. I feel the reason we need reparation is because y'all systematically did this to Black people. My cousin, my cousins, my friends, and people I've considered family, and my birth mom has been generally affected and has caused a lot in all our lives. That's it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jackson, for that moving personal testimony. We really appreciate it. At this time, we will go to Dr. Rucker Johnson, who will have 20 minutes to speak, and then we will turn it to the task force for comments and questions to the rest of the panelists. So Dr. Rucker Johnson, you now have the floor, and you may begin your testimony when you are ready. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you see my screen and hear me? And
yes.
The slides, yes?
Yes, both.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be before you. I want to thank the task force for their work. I want to thank my fellow panelists for sharing their moving remarks. Mi Mao, she was the first Hmong to be elected to a state legislative seat in the country in Minnesota in the 2000s. And she once said, every time I get up to speak, I get a lump in my throat. And my grandmother said the lump you're feeling in your throat represent the voices of all your ancestors that have gone before you, that have no voice. And now you have voice, and you're speaking on their behalf. And that's what you feel, the lump in your throat, is their voices demanding you represent their life experience, the unspoken. And so today, I have that one. I want to say that when we speak of the legacy of racism in the US and the glacial progress, the glacial pace of racial progress, it's really the unfinished civil rights agenda. And I want to speak specifically on the critical role of education policy. School quality is the engine of upward mobility. And yet historically, school funding mechanisms have been implicitly tied to long-standing assumptions about which communities and students are deserving of adequate educational investment, who has the greatest capacity to learn, and which students we set high expectations for and hold to high standards versus low expectations and low standards. Now, school segregation and unequal school resources are the nerve center of inequitable educational opportunity that perpetuates structural racism. A systems-based approach to inequality that considers the intersections of race and class, pre-K and K-12, public education, and health investments are essential to develop the requisite policy prescriptions for sustainable, equity-based reform. Now, what I want to kind of highlight here is the cycle of inequality, of unequal opportunities producing and reproducing inequality across generations. When we look at nationally representative set of children born into low-income families and examine how do they fare in adulthood, we see that 42% of children in those low-income families in childhood remain poor as adults, where we see a great degree of persistence in economic status across generations, particularly in the lower tail of the distribution. But it's really the racial disparities in multi-generational poverty that really brings it more clearly in view. Namely, that when we look at adults today who are low income, as defined by being in the bottom fifth of the income distribution, we see that among African Americans, the likelihood of being an adult in the bottom fifth of the income distribution is 42%. And we see that's roughly 15% for whites. But when we look at the generational persistence of that, if you look at the probability that an adult today is in the bottom fifth being low income, and their parents were also low income, we see that a third of Black adults today fit that description, while that's only 5% for whites. And finally, when we look at the probability of being poor today in the bottom fifth of the income distribution, and your parent was low income and your grandparent was low income, we see 22% of Black adults today have parents that were poor and their grandparents were poor, where we see that multi-generational poverty among whites only 1%. So what I want to highlight here is the generational link that connects the reason why the percentage of families that are Black that are in the bottom fifth of the income distribution is 42%, and yet 2/3 of families that were in the bottom fifth of the income distribution and their parents were also low income, that 2/3 of those families are Black, and that multi-generational poverty is a uniquely Black experience, meaning the persistence of that poverty. And a big part of that is the role of segregation. That when you look at adults today who are in the bottom fifth of the income distribution and their parents were in the bottom fifth and their grandparents were low income as well, 82% of the families that fit that generational profile are African American. That is not a coincidence, but a big part of the policy environment that has connected segregation to unequal opportunity. Now, What I want to first highlight is the slow speed of the glacial speed of racial economic convergence. Since the end of the Civil War, racial economic convergence in the U.S. has proceeded at a glacial pace from 25% in the black-white income ratio in 1870 to roughly 65% today. Now, what I just want to highlight, though, to you is that period that I've circled there is the period in which we had the greatest racial economic convergence that we've witnessed. And that period is precisely the period that overlaps cohorts that were exposed to significant efforts in integration. Now, what I also want to highlight is if there were no racial differences in economic mobility from one generation to the next, that is, if Black Americans experienced the same rates of generational mobility as their white counterparts, the speed of racial economic convergence would be more than twice the observed rate we see and have experienced from 1870 to 2010. In other words, racial disparities in income have declined at less than half the speed that would have been expected over the past 150 years if there weren't such a large racial difference in generational mobility, even controlling for the parents' original starting point. And this holds for the Reconstruction and Jim Crow eras, as well as the recent decades. This is drawn from recent work by Bob Margo, economist Bob Margo, and Pat Bayer. And so what this means is that for the past 150 years, for generation after generation, the economic success of Black Americans have consistently severely lagged those of white Americans who began their lives in otherwise comparable economic circumstances. And so you may want to reflect here on what drives that slow speed of racial economic convergence. Well, I'm emphasizing it's not just racial discrimination in schooling and job and the labor market and professions and lending and housing and policing and criminal justice. That's all true. But in addition, it's the segregation of opportunity, the persistently high levels of segregation in schools and neighborhoods are influencing the structure of opportunity for kids and thereby thwarting upward mobility prospects for Black children in particular. That Black and white families who are identical in almost every way in terms of household income routinely reside in neighborhoods that look nothing alike in terms of the available resources. So when we talk about integration, I don't just mean the assignment of children to schools, but we're fundamentally talking about per pupil spending, teacher quality, access to AP courses. We're talking about curricular quality, teacher diversity. Those are all the pieces that what integration means when it's applied. I want to highlight that the differences in parental wealth and the racial disparities in wealth are a big part of why affluent Black households, those with incomes above $75,000, live in neighborhoods with a higher average poverty rate than poor white households, that is those with income below 40,000. This has been shown in related work by Pat Bayer and Sean Reardon et al. Okay. Now, what I want to highlight is when you look at this period of the Black-white academic achievement gap, this period where we saw the greatest racial convergence in economic outcomes, in health outcomes, in academic achievement, again, is the period of cohorts that overlapped exposure to integration. We see the kind of major slowing down of that convergence since cohorts born after 1985. And so what I just want to highlight is when we think about the connections of racial stigma and structural racism, you have to understand it from a life course perspective, that the ways in which racial stigma leads to neighborhood segregation, that feeds and fuels school persistent segregation and access to opportunity, educational resources, and then that leads to differences in college readiness and in degree attainment. And those pieces are part of what democratize access to the labor market. And those pieces then spill over to criminal justice interactions and that, again, racial stigma around who's profiled, et cetera. And all of those pieces collectively impact the generational mobility process that leads to long-term economic standing and social status that then recycles its way through into the next generation. So what we're talking about here is these mechanisms for the slow glacial pace of progress is the housing discrimination, the racial wealth disparities, the racial differences in home ownership. Those are mechanisms, but it's really what we have to kind of understand is how these pieces lead to cascading effects across the life course. Disparities in academic achievement lead to disparities in access to higher education and labor market disparities, discrimination in criminal justice, disparities in economic status. And so we have to think about where is it that we intervene. Now, Brown v. Board and the subsequent movement for integration is what I'm going to be highlighting in part, just so that you can see that when we've had concerted, intentional efforts to disrupt the systems that reproduce racial inequality, that we've seen progress. Okay. Now, the Fair Housing Act of the late 60s from the Civil Rights Movement, integration, school funding reforms, both pre-K expansions and access, and school funding reforms that didn't rely solely on the property tax base to fund local schools. That when we've done those things, again, redesigning Section 8 housing so that concentrated poverty is not the essential reality for low-income, particularly Black households. Affirmative action, enforcement of anti-discrimination laws, the job training programs, right? Sentencing reform, minimum wage laws, and kind of greater enforcement of pay discrimination, and a more robust safety net. These are all pieces that have to be connected in a system-based approach. Now, what I'm just describing first is that there's an argument that school desegregation was a failed social experiment, or that school spending doesn't matter, or that pre-K is ineffective on long-term outcomes, and it's simply not borne out by the facts. Where we failed is discontinuing those efforts to integrate our schools, to invest in them equitably, and to begin in the pre-K years. So I'm just going to try to bring us back to where some of the movement began on the eve of the Brown v. Board. Now you can see, oftentimes people think of this as a Southern phenomenon, but actually we see there is a strong regional variation in terms of legal segregation prohibited, de jure, de facto. You know, we can see that in the South throughout legal segregation was required. But what we also understand is that the timing of actual integration efforts, that nothing happened after the first decade after Brown, that when we look at the map of when integration efforts really kicked off, that the first decade after Brown, there was little actual integration that occurred. And then we see with the 64 Civil Rights Act and putting teeth in enforcement, we see Jackson 1963 versus Pasadena. We see the Crawford 1976 case where they were grappling with how, in a firm that de jure school segregation and racially motivated school boundary gerrymandering was unconstitutional. And so it wasn't just in the South that these aggressive ways to resist integration were happening, but it was happening in California as well. And so what we show is by using the full universe of the timing of that set of integration efforts, we see that when the court orders were enforced, that we see a dramatic decrease in racial school segregation. And that led to significant increases of leveling up school resources to the level white students were previously getting, where we see children from the same districts after enforcement of school desegregation court orders, that we see about a 20% increase in per pupil spending among Black students being experienced relative to cohorts from those same schools that were previously confined to all racially segregated schools. So the dual system, what we then do is document how, when we follow those kids, these are cohorts born between 1950 and 1970. And what we see is among those cohorts that experience integration, that with each year of exposure, that Black children achieve much greater educational attainment, to the point where by the late 80s, the rates of college attendance rates for 18 and 19-year-olds, the Black-white difference, the rate at which Black children were attending college had actually risen to comparable rates as in many places as white students. What we also see is that that increase in educational attainment and educational quality was mirrored in significant improvements in adult earnings. that we see about a 1 to 3% increase in earnings with each additional year of exposure. That translated into about a 30% increase in adult earnings relative to prior cohorts that had been relegated to segregated schools from those same districts. And that led to a significant reduction in the annual incidence of poverty. That significantly led to about a 20 percentage point decline in the annual likelihood of poverty being experienced in adulthood compared to Black children from those same districts prior to integration going into effect. And we don't see that these impacts led to significant reductions in attainment for white children. Now, this was connected not only to school integration, but hospital integration, desegregation that preceded it, that in the South, access to hospitals had been significantly prevented. And basically, when we look at places, this is drawn from Ken Shea's et al.'s work, to show the decline in post-neonatal mortality rates, particularly in Mississippi and Alabama. And we see that led to significant improvements in infant health that then also led to significant improvements in educational and cognitive outcomes. So what I'm just trying to highlight here is that these changes, that segregation creates fertile conditions to act as a contagion, to accelerate the spread of infection of racism, and no U.S. institution has gone untouched. But what we have done is cease our efforts to integrate our schools. The inequalities baked into the system, the schools, the housing, the school funding, the public pre-K, the safety net, health policies, it's all connected. And so what we need in the policy debate is a systematic approach to segregation and discrimination that ties education to housing, pre-K and health, and other policy areas. And so in the contemporary policy influences on school segregation, the reason why we are currently at levels of segregation today that prevailed in the early to mid 90s, in the early to mid 70s, that is, we've resegregated, we reached peak integration levels in the late 80s, 1988 to be exact. And in each year since, we have begun to revert back to now the same levels that prevailed in the early 70s. And part of that is school closings and unregulated charter school growth and gerrymandered school district boundaries and a kind of federal hands-off policy around integration. We see racialized tracking, right, where the AP course and college preparatory course access is very different. Even a third of our public high schools that have a large Hispanic and Black enrollment, a third of them do not offer calculus, which is one of the gateway courses to STEM fields and being able to major in engineering and in some of those STEM majors in college. We see housing policies around zoning policies, as Stephen was mentioning, the provision of government services in terms of how we design our housing subsidies and in our housing programs that often confine lower income families to concentrated poverty neighborhoods. And then the real estate practices and mortgage lending discrimination that is coupled with it. And this is all layered onto the legacy of the restrictive covenants, the segregated housing projects. Now, when Stephen was describing the restrictive covenants, I grew up in the Minneapolis metropolitan area. And when my parents first bought their first home in a small suburb right outside of Minneapolis, they had still on the title deed the restrictive covenants that said this house is not to be sold to Negroes or Jews. And they saved that just for the safekeeping of recognizing this history in a generational sense is not far away, but its consequences are still being felt today. When we look at desegregated schools, the cosmetic appearance of them, we have to think about whether they're functioning in integrated fashion. That too often, even when we see what looks like diverse schools, that there's segregated classrooms within what otherwise ostensibly may look like diverse schools. So we have to think about how are we tracking students and having high expectations beginning in the early years so that there's not that kind of segregation. Now, what I want to highlight briefly, because I know I'm kind of running short on time, what I want to just highlight briefly is that what Pat Bayer, for example, has been able to document, as well as Sean Reardon, is that a significant part of this part of parental wealth differences. That when we look at the average neighborhood resourced environment that dictates access to school resources, et cetera, that the typical affluent Black household is in a less advantaged neighborhood in terms of resources than low-income white neighborhoods. Sorry, low-income white households. So if you look at Black and white households with the same parental income, that oftentimes the typical Black household, while having that same income, is in a much less resourced school environment. And what that means is that these prevailing high levels of segregation, they undermine equal educational opportunity. They're the single biggest driver of racial differences in upward mobility prospects for children. They make the nation less productive and competitive, and they weaken our economy. And so what we want to really do is think about how we can restructure these pieces. That while residential segregation patterns are by race and class are often viewed as the harmless byproduct of personal choices, or like simply the result of market forces, the causes and consequences of segregation are a direct byproduct of policy choices. Segregation has long been policy engineered. And so what we have to recognize is desegregation to integration means moving from access to inclusion. It's moving from exposure to understanding. And really, this is the way forward. And we have to recognize that putting billions of dollars into racially segregated and unequal structures can be counterproductive and can just be a recipe for inefficiency, not innovation. Housing and credit markets, education and schools, transportation and job creation schemes like opportunity zones, we need to think about creating opportunity in ways that recognize how segregation and its forces can undermine the true realization of equal opportunity for kids. And for every $100 of wealth held by white families, the average Black households hold up only $5. A quarter of Black families have no or negative net worth, compared with less than 10% of white families. And too often the study of inequality is ahistorical and falls victim to the policy amnesia about the long-run conditions that produce the current realities, the current disparities. Racial wealth disparities are not primarily driven by differences in individuals' savings behaviors, but instead are a legacy of segregative and discriminatory housing policies. This point is best highlighted by the fact that the typical Black American with a college degree has less wealth than the average non-college educated white American. The consequences of a concentration of wealth and affluence on the one hand, and the concentration of poverty on the other, that profoundly impact children's access to opportunity, may imperil our collective future. Too often, we have opportunity-rich communities where children thrive in well-funded, highly resourced schools that are geographically close, but socioeconomically worlds apart from the concentrated poverty schools within the same metropolitan area. It's become far too common to find a school-to-prison pipeline near a school-to-life success one in a neighboring district. These patterns begin early in children's lives, but our policy responses to them have occurred very late. So I want to stop here. I want to emphasize that I've tried to highlight the ways in which differential access to school quality and neighbor conditions explain the lion's share of racial differences in rates of upward mobility across children from low-income families. And we need policy responses that focus on the educational opportunity of children that are not dictated by zip code, race, skin color, and poverty. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to the question and answer with the task force, as well as other questions that may arise. There's many more things to say, but I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, for that expert testimony. We are 9 minutes ahead of schedule, so at this time, we will take it to the task force for comments and questions, but I do want to recognize Dr. Manidian you had 2 slides left that you weren't able to get to. So if you want to, pull up those last 2 slides, you're more than willing to do that at this time. We see the screen, but I can't hear you, so. And we see your screen, you're still sharing it, and you are also typing to us in the chat right now. Can anyone else hear Dr. Menidian?
I can't, but maybe while he's getting technically situated, maybe could we just take some questions from the task force, and then we can probably fold in Stephen's remarks in response to that. I think that will be a effective use of the time.
Yes, absolutely. Can we get a staff member to assist Dr. Menidian, particularly because he is still sharing his screen? Okay, thank you. So at this time, we'd like to take questions from task force members. Would any task force member like to direct a question to any of our panelists at this time? Also, the Blue Jeans app does not allow me to see every single person at one time. Okay, I see member Reggie Jones Sawyer, your hand is raised. You are recognized.
Okay, and this is probably for the whole panel, but for Dr. Johnson in particular. I've been reading some data on the effects and impacts on class environment, which, what type of school you have, how, what resources they can provide to the students, chemistry labs and things of that nature, versus class instructor, how well that class instructor, how well they are and proficient at what they do, and then class sizes reducing. And there was a study done in Tennessee where they provided the most optimal resources in that from preschool all the way until they graduated. Then after that, this was done in the 80s, they took that data and they compared what their salaries outcomes, which was increased. They looked at whether or not they had home ownership. Those individuals that participated in the study had home ownership was way up. And then they looked at their 401ks and whether or not they had it in retirement. It was way up. And what it reminded me of, when I first was elected in 2012, every private prison came into my office and told me that they needed 10,000 more prison beds in 10 years. And I said, that's interesting. What algorithm did you use? And they said, we can estimate 100% that we need 10,000 more prison beds by the number of third graders that can't read at third grade level. That was astounding to me. And I said, well, I have an interesting proposition. Why don't we educate those individuals so we can figure out how many more college seats we need to build? Well, those private prisons never came back to my office. And I realized then the school to prison pipeline can be closed if we have an effective education system. And so I'm using the premise of the class environment, what type of schools you have and how clean it is, how the educational opportunities are great, the instructor, whether or not they're motivated, they really want to teach the kids, and then we reduce the class sizes. If we did something like that, what could that be a start to impacting, ensuring that we have a better outcome with our students?
Well, I think that argument is the central focal point of my book, Children of the Dream, that we look particularly at the three policy prescriptions done in concert of school integration, school funding reform that ensures equitable school resources for all children, and then expansions of pre-K access. The Tennessee Star experiment that you're mentioning, that
Yes.
was a designed to be reducing the early elementary school grades, class sizes significantly, led to significant improvements in student learning, with the impacts biggest for low income and Black children. And they saw lasting effects. What I'm saying is my work on the policies outside of Tennessee, but with a nationally representative kind of portrait, very much mirror those impacts, that school resources matter, and that we have prior policy approaches that have often taken a kind of quarantine style approach to social problems, to distance socioeconomically advantaged groups so that the challenges of under-resourced schools can be confined to high poverty and minority neighborhoods, as if what affects some doesn't ultimately affect us all. So what I'm saying is that you can't know what you just described. The studies and the research that we do can't know those outcomes if we're not able to follow kids from birth to adulthood and link them generationally, and then look at what school environments they had access to during their school age years, and look at the full trajectory of outcomes, not just test scores, not just high school graduation rates. I'm talking college completion, college going rates. I'm talking about whether or not they have been incarcerated. I'm talking about health outcomes, earnings. And so we're able to do that and provide longitudinal data and studies that are following kids over a 40, 50-year period, linked to their parents' backgrounds, linked to the school environments, in much the same way that you described the Tennessee Star experiment, but where we're using the policy changes that happened in some states and some districts at different times in the lives of kids, and showing how holding constant or keeping the family background the same, can we intervene to change the third grader that was below standards in their achievement in third grade, but change their trajectory through higher quality teachers, better school environment. And we see that their fortunes can be significantly altered in a positive direction or reinforced in a direction that you speak, in the negative direction. And so the question is, what are the costs of inaction? And I'm putting forth that it's not just a moral imperative that we invest in our schools equitably in this way, but it is actually a argument that our economy's future depends on. There are a lot of lost Einstein when we don't invest and believe in the full potential of all our kids. And I'm specifically talking about Black children. Now, I'll also say, my fellow panelist who's a current freshman at Morehouse, I'm a Morehouse alum, so I have a particular affinity toward Morehouse and Black educators and the power of being exposed to a Black community that can empower. So I'm not suggesting that integration means that we don't rely on our Black community for that kind of lift. But what I'm saying is the resources that Black communities need require policy and connection. And that's not just for Black kids, but white kids benefit from that exposure to diversity too. Now, I'll be quiet, but I just wanted to at least try to respond. Hopefully that met what the spirit of what you were bringing with your thoughtful comment, Reggie, or Mr. Jones Sawyer.
Reggie's good. Thank you.
By the way, Mr. Smith, we're going to have a little separate conversation after this so we can connect.
You can have a third house grad too, so.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Vice Chair Brown is recognized, and then we'll return to Dr. Menidian. Thank you. Vice Chair Brown?
Is he muted?
Madam Chair,
Yes, Vice Chair Brown, you're recognized.
yes. I don't know whether or not this technology is working against me because we have too many Morehouse men on Zoom. I want to say that our presentations have been excellent. One thing that concerns me is that after we get the economic base, after we get into the schools, after we get the fair housing laws, there is no monitoring and accountability. No monitoring and accountability to make sure that persons who just don't have the political or the moral will to do right are held accountable. So that I would hope that we would all understand that Drinkwater said, knowledge we ask not, but help us to have the will of steel to do the right thing. And even if we get this reparation measure through, conceptually, politically, there's a major, major thing of making sure that it's actualized and concretely we get action. The final thing I want to point up is that we didn't say that much about gentrification, what that has done to the psychic, the culture, and the presence of Black folk, so that they will not be conspicuously absent and treated as invisible people. Other ethnic groups still have their visibility. They still have their watering holes and their bays. So we got to make sure that we approach, in my estimation, this thing in a fashion that at the end of the day, we get what was taken away from us, yes, our dignity, our economic power, education, all those good things. But we got to make sure that we still, too, as human beings, reserve the right to be who we are, and at the same time reach out to others and work as a dream team to make this nation what it claims to be, one nation under God, invisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Vice Chair Brown, for bringing those issues to our attention and for that offering. Now we would like to turn to Dr. Menidian for your last two slides, if you want to show them at this time.
Thank you so much for bearing with me, the task force and the chair. This is a little bit legalistic, so bear with me further as I try and present this, but this was something that the folks at the DOJ specifically asked me to address. So the terms de jure and de facto refer to, de jure means by law, and de facto just means natural or market-based, individual private actors. And the reason this comes up is in the context of racial residential segregation or school segregation, because the type of segregation it is, whether it's de jure or de facto, under prevailing Supreme Court jurisprudence, constitutional jurisprudence, determines the nature of the remedy. So if segregation is de jure, then it means that the government, whether it's local government, state government, federal government, has large leeway to remedy it. And if it's de facto, if it's just because of individual choices, as Rucker talked about, then the courts are much more circumspect about what government can do to remedy it. So unfortunately, because of the courts, the question of whether something is de jure or de facto seems to really have outsized significance. Richard Rothstein, in his book, The Color of Law, argues that American racial residential segregation writ large is de jure, not de facto. And the reason he says that is because even when something looks like it's just about market forces, there has been a significant government role. So let me give you an example that he provided to me. He's a good friend of mine that I wanted to convey to the task force. So he says, consider the Levitt towns, the, I think, 7 or 9 developments in Pennsylvania and Long Island during the post-war period that sort of epitomized suburban development. He says, of course, William Levitt was a bigot. Left to his own devices, he would have refused to sell a home to an African American. And some of the comments we heard this morning related to that in LA and elsewhere. But he wasn't left to his own devices. He built the project with FHA and VA guarantees for his bank loans. If the FHA and VA obeyed their constitutional obligations, they would have said to Levitt, yes, we'll guarantee your loans, provided you sell your homes in a non-discriminatory fashion. That they didn't do that makes the financing of Levittown unconstitutional, i.e. de jure. That Levitt was a bigot was true, but irrelevant. And so the point here is that some people might look at Levitt's developments and say, that's de facto segregation. But what Richard is saying is that because the government financed, subsidized, and underwrote these developments, and then further mandated through federal regulation that they prohibit that it was discriminatory and not non-discriminatory, that there's significant state involvement. Let me give you another example that he didn't provide. So the Berkeley City Council in January 1963 adopted what was then called an open housing ordinance, what today we would call a fair housing ordinance. So this is the city council adopting that for the city. Well, in remarkably swift fashion, opponents of that ordinance got onto the April ballot a ballot initiative to overturn that ordinance. And in April, they succeeded. There's a video you can find online called Assignment 4 Segregation Western Style that describes that campaign. So literally 4 months later, people of Berkeley got a ballot initiative on the city, on the ballot, and overturned that ordinance. Is that, how would that be de facto or de jure? They're using the levers of government power, right, to prohibit non-discrimination. So why does all this matter? Why does it matter if it's de jure or de facto? It's not just that the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution this way, but also the 14th Amendment, which is the second Reconstruction Amendment. Section 1 has 2 sentences. The first sentence guarantees citizenship, overturning Dred Scott. The second sentence has clauses relating to equal protection, due process, and privileges and immunities. The second sentence provides those protections against states. Therefore, the courts over 150 years have built in this state action requirement. Now, scholars like Eric Foner and others have said it's greatly overstated, and that there's Section 5 of the 14th Amendment enables Congress to pass legislation, as John Powell talked about in earlier testimony, under the 14th Amendment. But the courts have narrowly interpreted the second sentence of Section 1 because of the state action requirement. Now, my specific position, I have a slightly different position than my friend Richard, which is that I actually find the distinction between de jure and de facto to be largely untenable. And the reason is because government policy and private market actors are so inextricably linked. So for example, I talked about the 1900 and 1930 era where local government was influenced by private actors, by homeowners, building in and these restrictive covenants. Neighborhood associations promoted them. Local governments promulgated them, asking developers to adopt them. I just think it's a totally untenable distinction. I think going back, it's a legal fiction that we've developed. And so Justice Kennedy sort of represents this. And by the way, this extends almost all law. He says the distinction between government and private action can be amorphous, both as a historical matter and as a matter of present-day finding of fact. Laws arise from culture and vice versa. Neither can assign to the other all responsibility for persisting injustice. I concur. So that's the point I wanted to make. Thank you for allowing me to make that sort of esoteric point, but I know your folks thought that was important.
Absolutely, thank you. It was very important. At this time, I would like to turn it to task force members so that we can proceed with our questions and answer period. Are there any task force members who would like to direct a question to our esteemed panelists at this time? Again, you can either raise your hand, make your voice heard through the voice option, or you can utilize the chat option so that I can see your inquiry there. Did I see a hand?
I think
Yeah.
Senator Bradford has his hands up. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm having technical difficulty. I apologize.
Mr. Bradford or Senator Bradford, you're recognized.
Thank you. I just wanted to piggyback on what Vice Chair stated as the impacts of gentrification, which is real. And I think we can all identify prominent African American communities that have existed for the last 50 years that are no longer the case. But I also want to thank the two presenters as they highlighted zoning implications, because zoning laws replace restrictive covenants.
Senator, we can't hear you.
Oh, Mr. Bradford, we cannot hear you. Senator.
And single family. Yes. Can you hear me? I keep breaking up. That's why I parked.
Okay, can you just restart just after what you said about gentrification, how zoning replaced restrictive covenants?
Yeah, zoning replaced single family zoning replaced restrictive covenants as a way to prevent Black folks from moving in neighborhoods, because they assumed as we migrated from the South, we would be looking for apartments versus single family homes. And those zoning laws existed, and we just passed legislation here in California, SB 9, that allows us to revert back to that. But there was a lot of pushback by African Americans who didn't know the history and thought this is going to change the complexity of their neighborhoods. And in fact, it will allow more home ownership and more residential affordable housing for people of color. So just want to bring that to the attention, folks.
Thank you, Senator Bradford. Would another task force member like to ask a question at this time? Member Holder?
Yeah, I do have a question. I'm afraid I'm about to be cut off because I'm losing power, but I'll give it a try. And if I get cut off, I'll dial back in. I have a question for Dr. Johnson. And I want to just thank all of you for your incredible contributions to what we're trying to do here. And your comments were very powerful and useful for this process. So Dr. Johnson, I very much appreciated your perspective. I wanted to also, I know that you focused on structure, on making structural changes to increase access to educational opportunity. I also wanted to have you comment on the content of the curriculum and what changes need to be made to curriculum content to increase inclusiveness of curriculum, to increase the representation in terms of education and critical thinking, and to move away from Eurocentric content to content that centers the experience of the experience and the contribution of people of color throughout history. What impact do you think that would have in tandem with the infrastructure changes that you talked about in terms of increasing opportunity for all in the education system? Can't hear you.
Thank you. Thank you for that great point, Ms. Holder. I think that the point of what integration looks like is that Black families shouldn't have to choose between a school that has more resources, but where they have to fear that the teacher won't believe in their child's potential, or that they have to be concerned about implicit bias from the point of educators in more integrated spaces. Meaning, what we're really trying to say is a multicultural curriculum is required, that diversity is here to stay. So, when we're talking about what are the ingredients to prepare kids for the diverse world that they inhabit. It means that they have to be exposed to not Black people as the subjects of slavery, but rather the amazing contributions of Black inventors, the innovation, in other words, our best parts are not defined by how we have been treated, but the curricular aspects talk about King, but not the way King challenged a lot of the ideas around the structure. So I think when I'm talking about structural racism, I'm talking about things that aren't about the interpersonal experiences of discrimination, but rather the structures that are still in place that allow, even when explicit bias and explicit racism is addressed, that still leaves the lingering effects of what structural racism in terms of access to opportunity, which is the laws, the practices. So when you're talking about curricular quality and multicultural curricular quality, and you're really speaking to teacher diversity and the lack of sufficient numbers of Black educators in our classroom, these are all pieces that are central to advance opportunity and what we mean by school quality and what we mean by socio-emotional development and developing leaders that get and learn across difference. So I think what we're really trying to say is that's actually the architecture of that, the vision for that is something that many parents are desiring. And I think this is an opportunity for a multiracial coalition to bring that to pass. And I think your task force can accelerate the movement that is now where people are recognizing that. Now, I think with any major, bold, progressive reforms, I think you have to prepare in advance for the backlash. And so the question is, we've seen the backlash at every period of major progress. The question is, are we going to do something in a way that anticipates that? Because the hoarding of opportunity is always in search of new tools. As Dr. Amos said, I believe it was Dr. Amos said, we replace restrictive covenants with, some form of, zoning laws and policy. So the question is, what are the contemporary ways in which the hoarding of opportunity is using new instruments that we would have to then circumvent in a policy-oriented way to ensure equal opportunity in curricular access, in teacher quality, in teacher salaries, because that's a lot of what money buys. You can't have Common Core standards and say, we're going to have these high standards for college readiness that include all of these dimensions you're saying, but have really high teacher turnover in schools, have most Black children taught by novice teachers and inexperienced teachers in the areas in which they're credentialed. It doesn't succeed that way. So I think these are all pieces that we want to bring to bear on the question. So thank you for that.
Thank you. So quick timekeeping, we have 10 minutes left. But I did want to pose a question to Mr. Smith and to Mr. Jackson. So for Mr. Smith, my question relates to what you brought up in your testimony earlier about freedom schools. So just for the record, if you could expand on what freedom schools are, and then also if you can, expand on what you were also hinting about reparations, what that could look like for Black students in the school and university context. And also, you don't have to answer this last question, but I'm curious, the reasoning for choosing Morehouse over a UC or Cal State, and you can only feel free to answer that if it informs the discussion at all. If it was just a personal choice, that it's fine. I was just curious about that. And for Mr. Jackson, I had a question for you. You can answer after Mr. Smith. Can you, for the record, can you expand on your experience as an LA County Youth Commissioner, the work that you're doing in that role? And then also you said that you were able to get your high school diploma from an innovative program after your experience at Crenshaw High. And so I'm curious to know if those programs that you participated in, is there, a school to, after you get your diploma or GED or whatever it is there a track to assist you all in getting into college or other institutions of higher education? So Mr. Smith, you can go ahead.
So I'm kind of gonna, all three are gonna kind of intertwine. And so the reason why I chose an HBCU is because I found my safe haven. I felt supported. I had my support system there. I did not see that as much as I wanted to go to Berkeley, as much as I wanted to go to UCLA, I did not see that. Initially, I was kind of kept out because of the SAT. And then if I was to go, I have friends who now go and who have gone on to Berkeley and gone on to UCLA, and they don't have the support. Here at Morehouse, I do have the support. If I went to Howard, I would have had the support. If I went to any other HBCU, I would have had the necessary support, the cultural support. Everything I would have been at home. I would have been able to been educated, but also still maintain my social life as well. UCLA, I wouldn't have been able to do that. Cal State, yes, I would have been able to do that. However, I just didn't feel like I wanted, the programs that I wanted in sociology, I wanted to go to UCLA or Berkeley for specifically, but Morehouse was my best option. You had a question in regards to Freedom Schools. Freedom Schools started way back in the day where Black folks, during the civil rights movement, and it probably predates this, honestly, the model at least predates the civil rights movement, but it's where currently we have Chosen Defense Fund, has Freedom Schools, which is a six-week long program during the summer, where folks go, we read books, K through 12th grade. We read books, we have folks come in and speak to us and read books. We have a whole bunch of, I think someone raised their hand.
I think Vice Chair Brown, he might have raised as a time thing, but
okay.
Oh wait, Vice Chair Brown, did you want to say something? You're on mute.
Excuse me, I couldn't resist not raising my hand because my fellow Morehouse man is part of a movement that evolved out of the summer of 1964, when Julian Bond, Baron Wright Eldman, Bob Moses, and others in the Mississippi Delta, where Blacks terrorized and even murdered because they wanted to vote. And Reverend George Washington Lee was the first martyr of that era. On May the 7th, 1955, was on his way home, and members of the Ku Klux Klan shot his jaw off. He died before he could get to the hospital. He was president of the Bells-Only branch of the NAACP. It was in that culture, it was in that hotbed in the Mississippi Delta where Marion, Julian, and others picked up and said, we're going to continue to fight for the right to vote. But these white people are so racist that they've asked Blacks such crazy questions as how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap, or how many windows are in the courthouse to qualify to vote. And out of that summer, where they discovered that many of the Blacks did not really know how to read or write, Mary Wright Eldman and Julian and others said, well, we're going to teach our people. And the freedom schools were established. But after the movement of that 1964 period was over, Marion said, we need to look at these urban communities where Black children are too far behind because of a lack of opportunity for quality education in these urban schools. And out of that passion, out of that concern and that vision, freedom schools continued And I'm proud to say that Third Baptist Church of San Francisco now for 17 years has been involved in this Freedom School movement to make sure that we establish a means of making it anyhow. The racists won't do right if they don't have the will, and if we don't have the political clout to get them to do right by our children, we're going to learn anyhow. And that's what one man named John Bear Meacham did in 1827 in St. Louis, Missouri. What happened when St. Louis said no blacks could read? If they're caught reading, they're caught writing, they'll be beaten. What did the carpenter, John Bear Meacham, do? He, as a carpenter, built a steamboat and said, I'm going to put a steamboat on the Mississippi River. And he opened up a library and a school and floated over to Illinois, around the free states. And they learned anyhow. And his first student was John Turner, who was the founder of Lincoln University, the oldest higher education black institution in the state of Missouri. So it got me excited to start talking about what we've done in spite of what's been thrown at us.
Yes,
we
sir.
still have the will and the passion to say we ain't gonna let nobody turn us around or stop us from excelling.
2-3 sentences. Ms. Edelman and I spoke heavily about freedom schools and the creation of it. And she basically said that it's something that it's a model, it's a teaching model, or pedagogy that you in curriculum that you can take and apply to any situation. It doesn't have to be within the confines of a school, but it's just a model that is very culturally responsive. And so I think for me, that's something that when I think of liberation, that's what it looks like to me. And so that's where you're politically engaged and politically informed. That's something that's near and dear to me. Second thing that you asked was what is reparations?
Yes, what is reparations?
Yeah, what does reparation looks like in the collegiate sector? It's simply making sure that Black students have the resources that are necessary for them to succeed and for them to be in this space and, like I said, already succeed. And so having access to mental health, having access to dental, having access to eye care, having insurance, having scholarship opportunities, finances not being an issue when we get here, and making sure that professors also are culturally responsive and understanding. And so I think that's what reparations look like.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. And now LA County Youth Commissioner, Mr. Jackson. If you need me to reiterate the question, feel free, but if not, go ahead.
You ain't gotta be so formal. Thank you though. Let's call it. Yeah, so the school that I went to was called Free LA High School. It's held within Youth Justice Coalition, where I also work at as a youth organizer and the youth outreach coordinator. It's called it's an alternative high school. You can also get your GED there too. We have virtual classes and we have on-campus classes too. We're held within the old courthouse building that we took over in 2017, and we forced to close down in like 2012. And yeah, and we renovated it, and we do a whole lot of events there to let the community know about us. We give back food to the homeless, things like that. And there's legal clinics, and there's a second call. Other organizations also host it, and there's that high school. So yeah. And then I also was gonna say
college. The question is, do they assist folks in the alternative higher education program? I mean, in the alternative high school program, do they assist with college matriculation?
Oh, I mean, yeah, they do. But what you call it? Because it depends. Because we had a college coordinator. So right now we're just balancing, like we're just getting our college coordinators right now. Bring them back in. But yeah, we usually most 9 times out of 10, most of our students do be able to go to college. We help them apply for that too. For like community college, I was gonna go to college, but I kind of, you know, I had to worry about other things. I had to worry about work, making money, helping my mama with the rent. But what you call it? Oh yeah, so I was gonna be like, so the Youth Commission, it was established in 2020 by the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors. The Youth Commission is the official youth advisory board to the county. We are a youth-led organization that promotes youth participation in county affairs and policy development. Our members have experience in the foster care, juvenile justice, and homeless system. Can y'all hear me?
So we're running out of time. So continue your thoughts, and then in your thoughts, by summarizing what reparations will look like for you and people similarly situated as you, those who have gone through the school to prison pipeline track.
All right. What you call it? Well, the commission also provides a forum for youth perspective, empowering commissioners to impact the system that are intended to serve and support them, their families, their communities. What you call it? We can be able to make recommendations to the board, county departments regarding policies, agency budgets, programs, and practices that impact children, youth, families, and their communities. Proposed to the board and county department new policies, programs, and services that would positively impact children, youth, families, and the communities. Annually identify at least 3 focus areas for concentrated review, analysis, and where appropriate commission involvement, and propose some legislations, advocate and provide recommendations to the board consistent with board policies regarding existing and proposed legislation impacting children, youth, families, and their communities. We represent 10 million youth behalf of LA County, and what I feel like appropriate reparations are like for us is everything that that Smith had mentioned before, and I had mentioned in my speech, and I feel like we're owed like a big debt of money. I can't put a amount on it, but when I searched it up, it was like 12 trillion. I feel like that's the smallest amount of where it can be started at. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Jackson and Mr. Smith, for answering those questions. I would just like to color the rationale quickly for why I asked the question about whether those alternative high school programs are offering college matriculation is this, because at one point at UCLA in the 1960s, there was a program called the UCLA High Potential Program, where they recruited leaders in the South Central community, like Bunchy Carter and John Huggins, who were once Black Panthers, leaders of the Black Panther Los Angeles chapter. They recruited people like that to fulfill ethnic studies types of classes. And then upon successful matriculation from those ethnic studies programs, they were able to gain admission to UCLA. And so that program was actually taken away in 1969 when Bunchy Carter and John Huggins were assassinated on UCLA's campus at Campbell Hall, January 17th, 1969. But there has been conversations about what would it look like to bring something like that back in order to honor folks like, Commissioner Jackson, who have obviously shown high potential in the event that they would like to, attend colleges and universities like UCLA and Berkeley. So that was the rationale behind my question. Okay, great. Yes. Thank you again to all of our panelists, Dr. Rucker Johnson, Dr. Stephen Menidian, Mr. Jackson, and Mr. Smith. On behalf of the task force and the members of the public, we learned so much from your expert and personal testimony. And we look forward to engaging with you all further as this process develops. At this time, we would like to go to agenda item number 5, which is our lunch period. Again, sorry for going over a bit, 5 minutes. We will convene at 1 p.m. Where we will begin our second panel for the day on environmental racism, which will run for an hour from 1 to 2. So task force members, please be back onto the Blue Jeans platform no later than 12:50-ish, and we will have a hard begin time at 1 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Johnson, can I please get your contact information?
Yeah, let's see. Okay, I'm going to tell you orally. My first name is Rucker J, so RUCKERJ, at Berkeley, BERKELEY.edu. So send me a message now, and I'm going to send you back my cell phone, and then we'll figure out a time to do Zoom where we can connect. But I got good people there. I got people, colleagues of mine that are on the faculty there, so I definitely want to connect. And I'm just giving you my cell phone. Well, I feel like we're in a public space, but just
it's recorded.
If you email me, then I'll give you the rest of
Okay. Good to see Cindy Bradford too. All right.
Good to see you, Steve.
You too. I love your poster.